The smartest people in history were catastrophically, confidently wrong. Not fringe lunatics. The geniuses on your currency, in your textbooks, with their names on your hospitals. Here's what they actually believed. 1. For nearly a century, the greatest chemists in Europe believed fire wasn't a chemical reaction at all. It was a physical substance leaking out of things as they burned. They called it phlogiston, and they built an entire scientific framework around it. Georg Ernst Stahl formalized the theory around 1703, and it dominated chemistry for roughly 80 years. The problem that should have killed it early was this. When metals burn, they actually gain weight. If phlogiston were escaping the material should get lighter. Defenders of the theory didn't abandon ship. They got creative. They argued phlogiston must have negative weight, which is the scientific equivalent of explaining a broken budget by inventing money that counts backward. Antoine Lavoisier finally dismantled it in the 1770s and 80s by identifying oxygen as the actual agent of combustion. The punchline is that Joseph Priestley, the man who literally discovered oxygen, refused to abandon phlogiston theory until his death, insisting Lavoisier was wrong. History's best chemists spent 80 years building an elaborate explanation for fire, using an ingredient that doesn't exist. Your kid's science fair volcano has more empirical grounding than a century of professional chemistry. 2. For roughly 2,000 years, the medical consensus was that disease came from bad-smelling air rising from rotting matter. Smell something foul? You were already halfway to dying. The framework was called miasma theory. It dated to ancient Greece, and it was the dominant medical explanation through the early 19th century, meaning virtually every physician who ever treated a patient before 1880 operated on this assumption. It led to genuinely catastrophic public health decisions. London's Great Stink of 1858 prompted massive sewer reform, not because officials understood how disease actually spread, but because Parliament literally could not tolerate the smell of the Thames. It accidentally worked, reducing cholera for the completely wrong reason. When John Snow mapped the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak and identified a contaminated water pump as the source, the medical establishment dismissed him because the water didn't smell bad. Florence Nightingale, celebrated as a pioneer of modern nursing, was a committed miasmatist well into the germ theory era. The entire medical establishment spent 2,000 years diagnosing illness by sniff test. Your nose is not a diagnostic instrument. Physicians took until 1880 to learn this. Hopefully, you already knew. 3. For most of recorded history, educated people believed that living creatures, mice, flies, maggots, simply appeared from non-living matter. Leave grain in a corner. Wait. Mice. The theory was called spontaneous generation. Aristotle documented and endorsed it, and that single endorsement lent it enough intellectual credibility to survive for over 2,000 years. John Baptist van Helmont, a 17th century physician otherwise respected for legitimate contributions to chemistry, published a recipe for generating mice. Place a sweaty shirt and wheat in an open container for 21 days. He genuinely believed this worked. He published it. Nobody demanded a replication. Francesco Redi began challenging spontaneous generation in 1668 by covering meat with gauze and observing that maggots only appeared where flies could access the surface. A controlled experiment so straightforward it should have ended the debate immediately. It did not end the debate. The debate continued for another 2 centuries. Louis Pasteur's famous swan neck flask experiments of 1859 through 1861 finally closed the question by proving that sterilized broth stayed sterile as long as airborne microbes couldn't reach it. A credentialed 17th century scientist published a recipe for building mice out of laundry. Peer review at the time apparently had no objections whatsoever. 4. Physicists were absolutely certain that light, like sound, needed a physical medium to travel through. So they invented one, an invisible, massless, perfectly rigid substance filling all of space. They called it the luminiferous ether, and the most sophisticated minds in 19th century physics spent decades calculating its properties, measuring its drag, and arguing about its structure. The ether hypothesis was so deeply embedded that when the Michelson-Morley experiment of 1887 failed to detect any trace of it, most physicists concluded the experiment was flawed, not the theory. Lord Kelvin, one of the most decorated physicists of the 19th century, defended ether theory aggressively and considered its two remaining problems minor clouds that would resolve in ether's favor. James Clerk Maxwell's electromagnetic equations, which are still correct and still used today, were originally interpreted as describing waves moving through the ether medium. Einstein's special relativity paper of 1905 made ether not just undetected, but mathematically unnecessary, removing it from physics entirely in a single document. Space is not full of invisible jelly. The finest minds in 19th century physics spent decades calculating the properties of a substance that doesn't exist in a space they had never visited. Modern cosmology is still embarrassed about it at family gatherings. 5. Heat, scientists once believed, was not a form of energy. It was a weightless, invisible fluid called caloric that flowed from hot objects into cold ones like water draining from a bathtub. The theory was developed and championed by Antoine Lavoisier, the same man who destroyed phlogiston theory, demonstrating that being spectacularly right about one invisible fluid does not prevent you from being spectacularly wrong about a different invisible fluid. Caloric theory actually had genuine predictive power for many thermal phenomena, which is precisely why it persisted. It only broke down at extremes. Benjamin Thompson, also known as Count Rumford, fatally undermined the theory in 1798 by observing that drilling cannon barrels generated essentially unlimited heat through friction. If heat were a finite fluid stored inside matter, it should have run out. It didn't run out. The fluid didn't exist. James Joule's experiments in the 1840s definitively established the mechanical equivalent of heat, replacing caloric theory with thermodynamics, and closing the chapter on the second consecutive imaginary substance that Lavoisier had endorsed in a single career. The lesson is that being a genius does not make you immune to believing things that are completely made up. It just makes you significantly more eloquent about defending them. 6. For roughly 2,500 years, the standard medical response to fever, infection, pain, and inflammation was to remove large quantities of blood from the patient and observe whether that helped. The practice, traced to Hippocrates, persisted as mainstream medical treatment until the late 19th century, and was the operating assumption of virtually every physician in Western medicine's history. George Washington died in 1799 after physicians drained an estimated 40% of his total blood volume over roughly 12 hours to treat a throat infection. The bloodletting almost certainly accelerated his death rather than preventing it. Pierre Louis conducted statistical analysis in the 1830s, demonstrating that bloodletting did not improve patient outcomes, and the medical community largely dismissed his findings, not because his data was wrong, but because statistics were considered an inappropriate method for evaluating individual patient care. The practice was so entrenched that physician Benjamin Rush, a signatory of the Declaration of Independence, continued aggressively advocating bloodletting even as the mortality evidence mounted against it. The treatment for being dangerously ill was, for 2,500 years, to make you dramatically more physically depleted. The logic held up right until the patient stopped being able to report back on their experience. 7. For most of human history, the educated consensus was that the sun, the planets, and every star in the observable sky orbited the Earth. We were the center. Everything else rotated around us. Ptolemy's geocentric model, developed around 150 CE, was so mathematically sophisticated that it accurately predicted planetary positions for over 1,400 years, which is precisely why no one seriously challenged it. To explain why planets appeared to move backward periodically, the geocentric model required epicycles, meaning circles within circles within circles, a system of compounding complexity that should have been a conspicuous red flag, but functioned instead as evidence of the theory's sophistication. Copernicus published his heliocentric model in 1543, but deliberately framed it as a mathematical convenience rather than physical reality to avoid confrontation, and reportedly received the first printed copy on his deathbed. Galileo's telescopic observations of Jupiter's moons, objects clearly orbiting something that was not Earth, provided direct observational evidence against geocentrism and earned him house arrest for the remainder of his natural life. Humanity spent 1,400 years adding more and more circles to a broken model rather than questioning the foundational premise. Corporate strategy meetings have operated on identical logic in virtually every industry ever since. 8. For centuries, the brightest scientific minds in Europe and Asia dedicated enormous resources to the belief that common metals like lead could be chemically transformed into gold if you identified the correct process. The search for this process consumed fortunes, careers, and in documented cases, lives lost to toxic metal vapors inhaled during experimentation. Isaac Newton spent more time on alchemy than on physics or mathematics combined. His private papers revealed decades of meticulous alchemical experimentation, and he wrote over 1 million words on the subject, none of which has ever produced gold. Robert Boyle, considered a founding figure of modern chemistry, was a sincere alchemist who lobbied the British Parliament to repeal laws against gold transmutation so legitimate researchers could operate openly. The philosopher's stone, the supposed catalyst for the transmutation of base metals, was pursued by credentialed scholars across multiple centuries and multiple continents simultaneously. The genuinely cruel twist is that actual nuclear transmutation of lead to gold is technically possible with a particle accelerator, but the process costs vastly more than the gold it produces. Newton invented calculus, and then spent the rest of his available time trying to make gold in a laboratory. The man could derive the laws of planetary motion and still fall for a get-rich-quick scheme requiring magic rocks. 9. This one is a myth about a myth, which makes it twice as embarrassing. The story that medieval Europeans universally believed the Earth was flat, and that Columbus bravely sailed against this consensus, is one of history's most stubborn invented narratives. Educated people in medieval Europe knew the Earth was spherical. This knowledge was never lost. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with impressive accuracy around 240 BCE, and that calculation remained known in educated circles for centuries afterward. Thomas Aquinas, Dante Alighieri, Roger Bacon, and virtually every major medieval European scholar explicitly described a spherical Earth. The spherical model was standard curriculum in medieval universities. Washington Irving's 1828 fictional biography of Columbus invented the story of Columbus fighting a flat Earth-believing church, and that fiction has been repeated as history in textbooks ever since. The actual dispute over Columbus's voyage was about the size of the Earth, not its shape. Scholars correctly argued that Columbus had underestimated the circumference and would exhaust his supplies before reaching Asia. They were right. He found a continent nobody had charted. The famous story about medieval people believing in a flat Earth was invented by a novelist. The real myth isn't about the Earth's shape. It's about how confidently people repeat things they read in one place. 10. Biologists and physicians once believed that living organisms were fundamentally different from non-living matter, not just in complexity, but because they contained a special, non-physical vital force that animated them and distinguished the living from the dead. This belief was called vitalism. It was the dominant framework in biology and medicine through the early 19th century, and it was endorsed by chemists, physicians, and philosophers across Europe with complete institutional confidence. A pivotal blow came in 1828 when Friedrich Wöhler synthesized urea, a biological compound, from purely inorganic materials in a laboratory, demonstrating for the first time that organic chemistry could be replicated without any living organism participating in the process. Despite Wöhler's synthesis, vitalism persisted in various forms for decades because scientists kept encountering biological processes too complex to explain mechanistically with the tools available, and they repeatedly mistook complexity for evidence of a non-physical force rather than evidence of incomplete understanding. Vitalist thinking quietly underlies a surprising amount of modern pseudoscience, including energy healing and life force frameworks, which are the same theory wearing updated clothing and different pricing. Scientists spent centuries insisting life required a magic ingredient separate from ordinary matter. The ingredient turned out to be more chemistry. Life is under no obligation to be more mysterious than it already is. 11. Respected scientists and livestock breeders once believed that a female's offspring could be physically influenced by every male she had ever mated with, meaning a thoroughbred mare bred with a donkey could never again produce pure offspring, even if subsequently bred exclusively with thoroughbred stallions. The theory was called telegony. Aristotle endorsed it, and it remained a widely accepted belief among breeders and biologists well into the 19th century. Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin and a founder of the science of statistics, conducted controlled breeding experiments specifically designed to test telegony in the 1870s and found no evidence for it whatsoever. The scientific community was largely unconvinced by his negative results and continued believing the theory anyway. Herbert Spencer, one of the most influential scientific thinkers of the Victorian era, publicly defended telegony as late as 1893. August Weismann's germplasm theory in the 1880s finally provided a mechanistic explanation for why telegony was impossible. Genetic information flows only through reproductive cells, not through general bodily contact or the history of previous pregnancies. Victorian science told women their reproductive history permanently altered their future children's genetics. It was completely false and also conveniently aligned with every social prejudice of the era. That particular combination has historically proven extraordinarily durable. 12. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, mainstream science, not fringe pseudoscience, but peer-reviewed, institutionally supported, government-funded research, actively argued that human beings could be ranked into biological hierarchies based on measurable physical traits, and that these rankings justified differential treatment under law. Francis Galton coined the term eugenics in 1883 and framed it as the scientific application of selective breeding to human populations. He was celebrated by the scientific establishment, not marginalized by it. Craniometry, measuring skull dimensions to rank intelligence by racial classification, was practiced by credentialed anatomists at major universities across Europe and America. Samuel Morton's collection of over 1,000 skulls was considered a landmark scientific dataset. The United States passed the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, explicitly citing eugenic research from major American universities, and 33 states enacted compulsory sterilization laws, resulting in an estimated 60,000 forced sterilizations. Nazi Germany's eugenics program was explicitly modeled on American legislation, a connection American eugenicists had been proud of before the full scope of that program became internationally visible. Science says has been used to justify nearly every systematic atrocity of the modern era. The lesson is not that science is untrustworthy. The lesson is that science conducted in service of a predetermined conclusion isn't science. It's theater with better equipment. 13. For much of the 20th century, the dominant position in psychological and behavioral science was that the human mind was essentially a blank slate at birth, and that virtually all behavior, intelligence, personality, preferences, moral character, was entirely the product of environment and conditioning. John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, famously claimed he could take any infant and, through conditioning alone, produce any type of specialist he chose: doctor, lawyer, artist, beggar, or criminal, regardless of the child's inherent tendencies. B.F. Skinner extended this framework to argue that human language, creativity, and complex thought were entirely the products of reinforcement schedules. Noam Chomsky's 1959 demolition of Skinner's linguistics book is considered one of the most devastating scientific critiques ever published. Behavioral genetic studies consistently show that identical twins raised apart are more similar in personality, intelligence, and life outcomes than fraternal twins raised together, a finding structurally incompatible with a purely environmental model. The extreme blank slate position was partly maintained because acknowledging genetic influences on behavior felt politically dangerous given the recent history of eugenics, meaning one catastrophic theory produced an overcorrection directly into a different catastrophic theory. Scientists spent decades insisting that humans were born as completely neutral raw material. Anyone who had raised more than one child knew this was obviously false, and had been saying so the entire time. 14 many 20th century cosmologists, including highly credentialed and professionally formidable ones, believed the universe had no beginning and no end. That as it expanded, new matter continuously formed to fill the gaps, maintaining a constant average density for all of eternity. This was called the steady state theory, and Fred Hoyle was among its most capable defenders. Hoyle also coined the term Big Bang as a dismissive mockery of the expanding universe model. He considered a universe with a beginning to be philosophically and scientifically indefensible. The discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation in 1965 by Penzias and Wilson, found accidentally while trying to eliminate noise from a communications antenna, provided direct observational evidence for a hot, dense, early universe that steady-state theory had no mechanism to explain. Hoyle, despite being catastrophically wrong about cosmology's largest question, made genuinely important contributions to stellar nucleosynthesis, explaining how elements heavier than hydrogen are forged inside stars, demonstrating that being wrong about one foundational thing is fully compatible with being brilliantly right about another. Einstein himself introduced a cosmological constant into his equations, specifically to prevent them from predicting an expanding universe, later calling it his greatest mistake. The universe expanded regardless of everyone's theoretical preferences, on its own schedule, without consulting anyone. 15. In 1903, a respected French physicist announced the discovery of a new form of radiation that could be emitted by almost all substances, focused through aluminum, and detected by a sensitized screen. He called them N-rays, and over 300 papers on the subject were published by researchers across France within 2 years. René Blondelot of the University of Nancy was taken seriously enough that the French Academy of Sciences considered awarding him its most prestigious prize. American physicist Robert Wood visited Blondelot's laboratory in 1904, and during a demonstration in a darkened room, secretly removed the aluminum prism that was essential to the detection apparatus. Blondelot continued to report successful N-ray observations with no prism in place. Wood published his findings immediately. The entire N-ray edifice collapsed within months, and the episode became one of science's most carefully studied examples of what Irving Langmuir later termed pathological science, where the effect always hovers just at the threshold of detectability, resists independent replication, and eventually vanishes when examined rigorously. 300 papers were published about radiation that does not exist because everyone involved wanted to agree with the prestigious researcher who claimed to have found it. Science has formal procedures to prevent exactly this outcome. They sometimes work. 16 in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, serious credentialed astronomers, not science fiction writers, not journalists, not enthusiastic amateurs, argued that Mars was crisscrossed by an engineered network of canals built by a dying civilization attempting to distribute polar ice water to its equatorial regions. Giovanni Schiaparelli mapped what he called canali in 1877, the Italian word for channels, and an English mistranslation rendered this as canals, implying artificial construction, where Schiaparelli had only described natural features. Percival Lowell, a wealthy and influential American astronomer, built his own observatory in Arizona, partly to study this Martian canal network, published 3 widely read books arguing for an intelligent Martian civilization, and spent decades producing detailed maps of infrastructure on a planet he had never visited. Other skilled observers using comparable telescopes reported seeing nothing of the kind, but Lowell's social prominence and vivid descriptions dominated public understanding of Mars for an entire generation. When spacecraft first reached Mars beginning in the 1960s, the surface was revealed to be cratered, dry, and entirely canal-free. The canals had existed only in human visual processing, not on the planet. A man built an observatory and wrote 3 books about a civilization on another world that did not exist, based on squinting at a blurry image through a telescope in Arizona. 17, when geologists finally accepted that continents move, some proposed an explanation that did not involve the seafloor being created and destroyed. The Earth itself is expanding, pushing the continents apart as the planet inflates like an exceptionally slow balloon over geological time. The expanding Earth hypothesis was advanced by respected geologists, including Samuel Warren Carey in the mid-20th century, who used it to explain the apparent coastline fit of continents across ocean basins, the same fit that had prompted Alfred Wegener's plate tectonics proposal decades earlier. The hypothesis gained real traction precisely because plate tectonics was not yet fully accepted, and geologists were working to find any mechanism that could explain the obvious puzzle piece alignment of continental shapes. Modern satellite geodesy can now measure Earth's diameter to millimeter precision over time, and finds no systematic expansion whatsoever. If anything, the planet is cooling and contracting infinitesimally in the opposite direction. The discovery of seafloor spreading in the 1960s, new ocean floor created at mid-ocean ridges and destroyed at subduction zones, provided plate tectonics with the mechanism it needed, rendering the expanding Earth framework unnecessary. Scientists looked at a planet whose continents fit together like separated puzzle pieces and spent decades arguing about whether the box was getting bigger rather than asking whether someone had moved the pieces. 18. For decades in the mid-20th century, the dominant psychological and behavioral science framework held that acquiring a characteristic during your lifetime could be passed directly to your offspring through inheritance. This wasn't a fringe position. It was Lamarckism, named after Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who proposed the framework in 1809 with the sophistication of the best evolutionary thinking available at the time. His most famous illustration was the giraffe stretching its neck to reach higher leaves and producing offspring with longer necks as a result. Intuitive, reasonable sounding, wrong at every level of mechanism. August Weismann ran a controlled experiment in the 1880s by cutting the tails off mice across 22 consecutive generations and observing that offspring were born with normal tails every single time. A direct empirical test. The framework failed it without ambiguity. The Soviet Union under Stalin institutionalized a Lamarckian successor called Lysenkoism, rejecting Mendelian genetics as ideologically incompatible with communist theory, and Soviet agricultural science suffered measurably as a result. Crops failed, biologists who disagreed were imprisoned, and an entire nation ran its food production on inherited acquired characteristics that do not exist. Your children do not inherit your effort. Life is under no obligation to reward your hard work at the genetic level. 19. The medical establishment performed open-heart surgery on conscious premature infants without anesthesia well into the 1980s, justified by the clinical belief that newborns lack the neurological development to process pain in any meaningful way. This was not a rogue practice at disreputable institutions. It was standard procedure at major medical centers operating under an assumption that had never been rigorously tested. Infants were administered paralytics, drugs that prevent movement, while remaining fully conscious during the procedure, because the medical consensus held that observable responses to pain were reflexes rather than genuine pain experience. The physiological evidence of stress response was measurable: elevated cortisol, increased heart rate, observable behavioral changes immediately following procedures. These were classified as reflexes, specifically because the alternative conclusion was too significant to absorb without more evidence than anyone had formally gathered. The turning point came partly through Jill Lawson's public campaign after her premature son died in 1985, following cardiac surgery conducted without anesthesia. The American Academy of Pediatrics updated its position on neonatal pain management in 1987. The medical establishment had been causing preventable suffering for decades, based on an assumption it had never adequately tested. The gap between what medicine believes and what medicine knows has historically been measured in the suffering of people who couldn't report it. 20. Before Darwin provided a mechanism for evolution, the leading framework for understanding how organisms changed over time held that characteristics an individual developed during its lifetime could be passed directly to offspring. Work your muscles and your children start stronger. Stretch for higher food and your offspring grow taller. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's framework, covered in its Soviet institutional form above, deserves examination at its foundational level because it was genuinely the most sophisticated attempt to explain biological change before hereditary mechanisms were understood. The problem is that your body has no mechanism to write life experience modifications into your reproductive cells. The DNA in your sperm or eggs does not update based on what your muscles did this year. Epigenetics has been cited in popular science writing as a rehabilitation of Lamarck, because environmental factors can influence which genes are expressed across generations. This is not the same thing as the inheritance of structural modifications. A gene being switched on or off is not the same as a giraffe's stretched neck becoming heritable anatomy. Weismann's tailless mice kept producing tailed offspring for 22 generations. The mice were not being stubborn. The mechanism Lamarck described simply does not exist, and the mice demonstrated this with more consistency than most scientific experiments manage. 21. The word natural on a product label is treated as a meaningful guarantee, a signal that what you're consuming is inherently safer, purer, and more trustworthy than its synthetic alternative. This intuition is the operating assumption behind billions of dollars in consumer decisions every year. It has no scientific foundation. The category of natural contains arsenic, mercury, botulinum toxin, and cyanide. It also contains every synthetic pharmaceutical's molecular template, because chemistry doesn't maintain a moral registry sorted by origin. The appeal to nature as a quality indicator conflates source with safety in a way that should collapse on contact with any specific example, but somehow survives every confrontation intact. 19th and early 20th century physicians prescribed naturally occurring arsenic as a health tonic and beauty supplement. Consumers purchased radium-infused water crocks because radium was a naturally occurring element with dramatic energetic properties. Tobacco is a plant. The natural equals safe framework is not a recent marketing invention. It is one of the oldest and most resilient errors in human risk assessment, and credentialed scientists and physicians have fallen for it in documented, measurable, fatal ways throughout history. The most effective poisons in existence are entirely natural. Nature did not design them for your benefit and does not distinguish between you and anything else consuming them. 22. Mesmer was a trained physician with a genuine medical degree who convinced much of educated European society that he had discovered a natural force, animal magnetism, an invisible fluid permeating all things that could be manipulated by a trained practitioner to cure disease. His patients genuinely reported improvement. His treatment rooms in Paris were packed with paying clients from the highest levels of French society, and the reported effects were real enough that the French Academy of Sciences took the claim seriously enough to investigate. King Louis XVI appointed a royal commission in 1784, whose members included Benjamin Franklin and Antoine Lavoisier. Their investigation was a landmark in the history of controlled experimental testing. They demonstrated through systematic blinded tests that mesmerism's effects disappeared completely when subjects didn't know they were being treated, and appeared when subjects believed they were being treated but weren't. The conclusion was scientifically correct. Imagination alone accounted for the effects. Mesmerism continued thriving for decades afterward because the effects were real, even though the explanation was completely wrong. Mesmer was accidentally discovering something genuine, the therapeutic power of expectation and suggestion, while explaining it with an invisible fluid that doesn't exist. Benjamin Franklin ran a controlled experiment proving a popular medical treatment worked by imagination in 1784. The treatment remained popular anyway. People kept paying for it. 23. The original nebular hypothesis that the solar system formed through the simple, orderly collapse of a uniform rotating gas cloud was considered a settled, elegant explanation for planetary formation for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Pierre-Simon Laplace formalized it around 1796, and its mathematical elegance made it the dominant cosmogony for over a century. The problem that should have ended it early was angular momentum. The Sun contains 99.8% of the solar system's mass, but only about 2% of its angular momentum. The planets carry most of the rotation. A simple uniform collapse cannot produce this distribution, and the discrepancy was identified in the 19th century as severe enough that by the early 20th century, the nebular hypothesis was temporarily replaced as mainstream cosmogony by catastrophic encounter theories. Proposals that another star passed close enough to the Sun to tear out material that became the planets. That theory had its own fatal problems. Modern protoplanetary disk theory eventually rescued and comprehensively revised the original nebular hypothesis, incorporating magnetic braking, disk instabilities, and significant planetary migration. The solar system's current configuration required multiple large planets to move substantially from where they formed. Scientists replaced an elegant theory with a catastrophic collision theory, then replaced that with a better version of the original. The solar system didn't consult anyone about preferred narrative structure. 24. Franz Joseph Gall was a genuinely skilled neuroanatomist who made real contributions to understanding brain structure, and then used that legitimate credibility to build a system in which the specific bumps and contours of your skull accurately revealed your intelligence, moral character, criminal tendencies, and emotional traits. The field was called phrenology, and it was institutionalized at a scale that should make you reconsider how much institutional adoption tells you about accuracy. Phrenological societies operated across Europe and America. Practitioners charged fees for character assessments. The framework was used in hiring decisions, court cases, and immigration screening. Johann Gaspar Spurzheim, Gall's collaborator, mapped 35 distinct mental faculties to specific skull regions with precise cranial locations that any trained practitioner could assess for a fee. As late as the 1930s, phrenology machines existed that could automatically scan skull contours and print a character assessment on a card, functioning like a medical vending machine of pseudoscience. The brain does not press its faculties into the skull. Skull shape has no relationship to cognitive function, personality, or moral character. For over a century, people paid credentialed professionals to feel their heads and receive a verdict. The professionals were wrong every time in ways the system had no mechanism for detecting. Several things that still exist operate on identical epistemological foundations. 25, until shockingly recently, mainstream medical practice operated on the belief that most stomach ulcers were caused by excess stomach acid, triggered by stress, diet, and the specific personality type of the driven, anxious professional. Treatment focused on antacids, stress reduction, and dietary modification. The acid suppression pharmaceutical market was enormous and financially central to gastroenterology. When Barry Marshall and Robin Warren identified Helicobacter pylori as the bacterial cause of most peptic ulcers in the early 1980s, the medical establishment's rejection was comprehensive. The finding was not merely questioned, it was considered implausible, because the stomach's extreme acidity was understood to make bacterial colonization impossible. Marshall's response to this rejection was to drink a solution of H. pylori, develop gastritis, treat himself with antibiotics, and document the entire sequence. It took over a decade for H. pylori treatment to become standard clinical practice after their initial publication. Patients continued receiving ineffective acid suppression therapy while the correct treatment existed and was being actively suppressed by institutional momentum. Marshall and Warren received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2005, approximately 20 years after their findings were dismissed as impossible. A physician drank bacteria to prove they caused ulcers. The medical establishment continued prescribing antacids for another decade. The Nobel Committee eventually agreed with the bacteria. 26. For several decades in the mid-20th century, the medical community regarded destroying the connections in the brain's frontal lobe as a legitimate, humane treatment for mental illness, severe depression, chronic anxiety, and a range of other conditions. The procedure was called lobotomy, and Antonio Egas Moniz developed it and received the 1949 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for doing so. The Nobel Committee has never rescinded that prize. Walter Freeman popularized the transorbital technique in the United States, inserting an ice pick-like instrument through the eye socket and sweeping it to sever frontal lobe connections, performing the procedure as an outpatient surgery rapid enough to conduct in series at psychiatric hospitals. He reportedly traveled in a vehicle he called the lobotomobile. Freeman performed approximately 3,500 operations over his career, including at least 19 children, with the youngest being 12 years old. The procedure did not cure mental illness. It produced severe cognitive damage, personality destruction, and in many cases left patients in states measurably worse than their original conditions. It fell out of favor not primarily because of ethical concern, but because chlorpromazine, the first antipsychotic drug, became available in the mid-1950s and produced better outcomes with less irreversible damage. A man drove a van full of modified ice picks to psychiatric hospitals and received awards. The pill that replaced him was what ended the practice. 27, across at least 7,000 years of documented human history, on every inhabited continent, surgeons drilled holes through living patients' skulls as a medical treatment for headaches, seizures, mental illness, and spirit possession. Trepanation is the oldest known surgical procedure, and it was independently invented by multiple separate cultures with no contact with each other. A fact that tells you something about the universal human drive to do something decisive when confronted with a problem, regardless of whether the thing being done helps. The evidence that many patients survived is not theoretical. Healed bone growth around drill holes in archaeological specimens confirms that patients lived for months or years following the procedure. This makes trepanation not purely an act of ignorant violence. It demonstrably reduced intracranial pressure from head trauma by relieving bleeding inside the skull, which would have appeared to cure symptoms in specific cases. The procedure worked in particular circumstances for completely wrong reasons, which is one of the more dangerous outcomes a medical treatment can have, because success in the specific case provides false confidence for application in every other case. Trepanation currently has a small modern revival among fringe communities who believe self-administered cranial holes increase cerebral blood flow and expand consciousness. The evidence base for this application remains precisely as strong as it sounds. 28. The word malaria literally means bad air in Italian, because physicians across multiple medical traditions correctly observed that people who lived near swamps developed a specific pattern of recurring fevers, and confidently concluded that the swamp air itself was the cause. The observation was accurate. The mechanism was wrong by one organism. Swamps were relevant to malaria not because their air was corrupted, but because Anopheles mosquitoes breed in standing water, and those mosquitoes carry Plasmodium parasites that cause the disease. The miasmatic explanation for malaria was so intuitive. Swamp air smells foul. People near swamps get sick. That it persisted for over 2,000 years across independent medical traditions. Ronald Ross identified the mosquito as the malaria vector in 1897 by dissecting mosquitoes and demonstrating Plasmodium parasites in their salivary glands. He received the Nobel Prize in 1902. The practical consequence of the correct understanding was transformative, but also quietly ironic. Draining swamps and using mosquito netting reduced malaria not because they improved air quality, but because they eliminated breeding grounds and blocked vector contact. The intervention that had worked based on the wrong theory worked better when understood correctly. Humanity accidentally controlled malaria for centuries by improving the smell of swamps. It worked despite the mechanism being entirely fictional for the entire duration. 29. In the early 20th century, immediately following the discovery of radioactivity, the consumer market enthusiastically adopted radiation as a health-promoting substance. This was not a fringe wellness trend. It was mainstream commerce, medically adjacent, and culturally prestigious. Radium water crocks, called revigators, were sold as ceramic containers lined with radioactive ore that would irradiate your drinking water overnight, with instructions suggesting 6 or more glasses daily for health. Eben Byers, a wealthy American socialite, consumed several bottles per week of Radithor, distilled water with dissolved radium, for years. His jaw, skull, and much of his facial bone structure eventually disintegrated from radiation necrosis before his death in 1932. A Wall Street Journal headline read, "The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off." Marie Curie herself died of aplastic anemia in 1934, almost certainly from decades of accumulated radiation exposure. Her laboratory notebooks remain so radioactive that researchers must sign liability waivers before handling them, and the notebooks are stored in lead-lined boxes. Factory workers who painted watch dials with radium-based paint in the 1920s and were instructed to sharpen their brushes with their lips developed radiation-induced cancers of the jaw. People drank radioactive water every morning for their health. The early 20th century had a complicated relationship with the concept of beneficial. 30. Barbara McClintock discovered that genetic elements could physically move around within the genome of maize, copying and reinserting themselves at different locations in the 1940s and 1950s. The scientific community largely rejected and ignored her findings for decades because the established framework held that the genome was a stable, fixed master blueprint that remained essentially unchanged within an organism's lifetime. Mobile DNA elements were considered impossible within that framework, not because anyone had tested the specific question, but because the premise of genomic stability was so foundational that evidence against it was interpreted as measurement error rather than discovery. McClintock received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1983, roughly 30 years after her key discoveries were made and dismissed. Transposable elements, the jumping genes she identified, now appear to constitute approximately 45% of the human genome by some estimates. Nearly half of your DNA consists of elements with the capacity to move, copy, and insert themselves into new locations. The genome is dynamic, responsive, and structurally nothing like a fixed blueprint. Scientists called nearly half of your DNA junk for decades because they couldn't determine what it did. It turned out to be doing things. The confidence with which researchers labeled biological structures useless before understanding them is one of the more consistent patterns across the entire history of science. 31. For centuries, physicians and the educated public believed that a pregnant woman's emotional experiences, visual shocks, and intense cravings could physically alter the developing fetus, producing birthmarks shaped like the fruit she craved, or deformities corresponding to something frightening she had witnessed during pregnancy. This was called maternal impression, and it was not folk belief held by uneducated populations. Ambroise Paré, the most celebrated surgeon of 16th century France, documented case studies of fetal deformities he attributed to maternal fright with the same methodological seriousness he applied to his legitimate surgical observations. The theory provided a socially efficient explanation for birth defects that simultaneously deflected inquiry into structural or genetic causes while assigning responsibility to the mother's failure to maintain emotional composure. Joseph Merrick, known historically as the Elephant Man, attributed his own skeletal condition to his mother having been frightened by an elephant while pregnant with him, not as a metaphor, but as a sincere causal account he had internalized from the available medical framework. There is no biological mechanism by which seeing a frightening animal transmits its shape to an embryo. Educated physicians spent centuries documenting and categorizing the ways a mother's emotional failures had physically damaged her child. The theory was wrong about biology and remarkably efficient at assigning blame. Both qualities contributed equally to its longevity. 32. In 1961, Soviet scientist Nikolai Fedyakin discovered anomalous properties in water condensed in extremely fine glass capillaries. It appeared denser, more viscous, with a higher boiling point and a lower freezing point than ordinary water. His colleague Boris Deryagin, a highly decorated Soviet scientist with genuine research credibility, amplified the findings and pushed them into international prominence under the name polywater. Over 300 papers were subsequently published about it. Western laboratories, operating under pressure not to fall behind Soviet scientific achievement, rushed to replicate the findings and largely confirm them. Contaminated samples producing contaminated results in a self-reinforcing feedback loop driven by expectation and competitive anxiety. The United States Pentagon reportedly became concerned that if polywater were real, it could potentially seed ordinary water supplies and convert them to a gel, a scenario that generated genuine national security discussion about a substance that was dirty water in a dirty glass tube. Infrared spectroscopy definitively identified the anomalous properties as dissolved silicates, sweat residue, and other contaminants from the capillary walls by 1973. Deryagin eventually acknowledged the error, one of the more dignified retractions in the history of pathological science. The American government briefly worried that the Soviet Union had discovered a way to turn the world's water into gel. The discovery was a contaminated tube. Geopolitical anxiety is a powerful distorting lens on experimental data. 33. In 1989, two electrochemists at the University of Utah held a press conference to announce they had achieved nuclear fusion at room temperature using equipment simple enough to fit on a laboratory bench. A result that, if accurate, would have meant unlimited clean energy produced from seawater using technology cheap enough for widespread deployment. Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Ponce made this announcement before peer review, under pressure from their university, which was racing to establish patent priority. The announcement generated immediate global sensation. Dozens of laboratories worldwide attempted replication within weeks. Results were inconsistent and irreproducible, with positive results correlating heavily with labs that had prior relationships with the original researchers, and negative results coming consistently from independent groups. The United States Department of Energy conducted formal reviews in 1989 and again in 2004, and both found insufficient evidence to justify a dedicated research program. A community of researchers continues working under the rebranded name Low-Energy Nuclear Reactions. Mainstream physics regards the field with skepticism that borders on dismissal, not because the result would be unwelcome if confirmed, but because it has not been independently confirmed in 35 years of attempting. Two scientists announced they had solved the global energy crisis in a beaker and held a press conference before verifying it was true. The energy crisis remains unsolved. The beaker remains a beaker. 34, for most of the 20th century, neuroscience held that the adult brain was fixed, that the neurons you were born with were the neurons you kept, and that no new ones were ever generated after early development. Lose neurons, and you lose them permanently. This framework was so deeply embedded that when Joseph Altman produced evidence of adult neurogenesis in rats in 1962, the neuroscience establishment dismissed and largely ignored the findings for decades, because adult neuron generation was considered impossible within the fixed brain model. Michael Kaplan produced electron microscope images of new neurons in adult rat brains in the 1970s, and prominent neuroscientist Pasko Rakic publicly dismissed the work with enough force that Kaplan's career suffered measurable professional consequences for producing correct results that contradicted consensus. Fernando Nottebohm's work in the 1980s on songbirds, showing that male birds grew new neurons in brain regions associated with song learning each breeding season, finally began cracking the consensus from a direction that couldn't be dismissed as easily. Adult neurogenesis in the human hippocampus was confirmed by the 1990s, though its extent and functional significance remain actively debated. For most of the 20th century, neuroscience told you that every brain cell you damaged was a permanent loss. The brain had been quietly generating new cells the entire time. It did not inform anyone. The field updated its position approximately 30 years after the first evidence arrived. 35. For over 2,000 years, the dominant medical framework held that the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that health, disease, and personality were determined entirely by their relative balance. Humorism was systematized by Hippocrates and Galen, and remained the foundation of Western medicine for roughly 2 millennia, which is longer than any other medical framework in human history. That duration is not evidence of its accuracy. It is evidence that a theory's persistence and a theory's correctness are entirely separate measurements. The 4 personality temperaments derived from this framework, sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, and melancholic, survived as psychological categories long after the physiological framework was abandoned, and still appear in popular personality typing systems today, which tells you something about how slowly cultural frameworks evacuate the premises after the science beneath them collapses. Treatment under humorism aimed at restoring balance by removing or augmenting whichever fluid was in excess, producing the therapeutic trifecta of bloodletting, purging, and induced vomiting that defined Western medicine until the 19th century. The framework's most effective survival feature was that it could not be proven wrong by patient deaths. If the patient died, the imbalance was simply too severe to correct. A theory that explains all outcomes equally explains nothing, and medicine ran on one for 2,000 years. 36. Before spontaneous generation was fully debunked for microorganisms, An earlier and considerably more ambitious version of the theory held that complex animals, mice, frogs, insects, could arise quickly and spontaneously from the right combination of non-living materials with no parent organism involved whatsoever. Aristotle documented the spontaneous generation of insects from morning dew, eels from river mud, and various other animals from appropriate organic substrates, not as speculation, but as careful naturalistic observation. John Baptist van Helmont published his wheat and shirt recipe for generating mice as experimental science in the 17th century, a man who made legitimate contributions to chemistry in other areas of his work. Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar with a remarkable range of genuine scientific interests, maintained detailed records of attempts to generate worms from specific organic mixtures. Francesco Redi's 1668 experiment, demonstrating that covered meat produced no maggots while uncovered meat did, provided the first controlled refutation of complex spontaneous generation, yet the debate persisted for another century before the implications were broadly absorbed. The 17th century's peer review process did not flag a published recipe for building mice from grain and unwashed laundry as requiring additional replication before acceptance. Science has since introduced more formal verification requirements. The mice have not been forthcoming regardless. 37, when tobacco arrived in Europe from the Americas in the 16th century, it was enthusiastically adopted not merely as a recreational substance, but as a medicine, prescribed by credentialed physicians for headaches, respiratory conditions, wounds, and as a general health tonic for people seeking improvement in their overall vigor. Nicolas Monardes, a Spanish physician, published an influential 1571 treatise promoting tobacco as treatment for at least 36 distinct ailments, including cancer, specifying that tumors should be treated with direct tobacco leaf application. English physician John Hill published the first clinical description of a tobacco-related cancer in 1761, noting that heavy snuff users developed nasal polyps and malignancies. This finding was largely ignored for nearly 2 more centuries. The tobacco-cancer connection was not established to the satisfaction of the medical mainstream until the early 1950s through the work of Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill, after which the cigarette industry spent decades funding research specifically designed to manufacture the appearance of scientific uncertainty about conclusions that were not genuinely in doubt among researchers. As recently as the 1940s and 50s, cigarette advertisements featured physicians endorsing specific brands. A 16th century physician prescribed tobacco as a treatment for cancer. 4 centuries later, physicians were endorsing cigarette brands in magazines. The substance's journey from cancer cure to cancer cause required roughly 400 years and a significant number of deaths that did not need to happen. 38 in the 19th century, arsenic was consumed deliberately as a health tonic and beauty supplement, taken orally to improve complexion, increase endurance, and promote general physical vigor, with the arsenic-eating communities of the Austrian Alps becoming a celebrated and widely discussed medical curiosity rather than a public health emergency. The Styrian arsenic eaters were documented by multiple physicians in the mid-19th century as apparently healthy individuals consuming doses that would kill a non-habituated person, explained by gradual physiological tolerance, and presented as evidence that arsenic was beneficial rather than evidence that the human body adapts to chronic poisoning under survivorship conditions. Fowler's solution, potassium arsenite, was prescribed by physicians for malaria, syphilis, and assorted other conditions from the 18th into the early 20th century. Arsenic complexion wafers were sold through mainstream pharmacies in the Victorian era as cosmetic products. The mechanism by which arsenic appeared to improve complexion was cellular damage at low doses, producing a temporary surface effect. Mild chronic poisoning, creating a visible appearance of health while systematically destroying tissue beneath it. Victorian women took arsenic pills for clearer skin. Victorian physicians prescribed arsenic tonics for their patients. The Austrian Alps had communities eating arsenic recreationally and demonstrating their good health to visiting researchers. Arsenic was unimpressed by all of it and continued being arsenic the entire time. 39, Franz Anton Mesmer was a trained physician with a genuine medical degree who developed a complete therapeutic system around animal magnetism, an invisible fluid permeating all living things that could be manipulated by a skilled practitioner to restore health. His Parisian treatment rooms attracted patients from the highest levels of French society. His reported success rates generated serious institutional attention, and the French Academy of Sciences considered his claims important enough to investigate formally. This item examines mesmerism at its foundational conceptual level, rather than the Royal Commission investigation covered earlier. The specific intellectual error was not fraud, but something more instructive. Mesmer was accidentally discovering real phenomena, the therapeutic effects of expectation, suggestion, rapport, and focused attention, and explaining them with a mechanism that doesn't exist. The invisible fluid was wrong. The effects were real. This combination is more dangerous than simple fraud because it provides genuine experiential confirmation for a false explanatory framework. Every patient who genuinely improved after Mesmer's treatment became evidence for animal magnetism rather than evidence for suggestion. The theory was structured so that its successes confirmed it, and its failures were attributed to individual patient factors. Discovering a real effect and immediately building the wrong explanation around it, then defending the explanation because the effect is real, is a failure mode that has appeared in the history of science with uncomfortable regularity. 40. When John Dalton formalized atomic theory in the early 19th century, atoms were conceived as the final indivisible units of matter, tiny, solid, indestructible spheres that combined in fixed ratios but could not themselves be divided, altered, or transformed. The word atom derives from the Greek for uncuttable, a name that embedded the theory's central claim directly into the vocabulary used to discuss it, making the assumption harder to question, because questioning the assumption required questioning the word. Dalton's framework was remarkably productive despite this incorrect foundational claim. The fixed ratio combining behavior it predicted was correct, and remained correct when the internal structure was eventually discovered. J.J. Thomson's 1897 discovery of the electron established for the first time that atoms contained smaller, separable components. Ernest Rutherford's 1909 gold foil experiment revealed that atoms are mostly empty space, with a dense, concentrated nucleus, demolishing Thomson's own subsequent model of electron distribution. The splitting of a uranium nucleus in 1938 by Hahn, Strassmann, Meitner, and Frisch demonstrated that atoms are not only divisible, but that dividing them releases energy sufficient to rearrange geopolitical structures. Scientists named the fundamental unit of matter after the word for uncuttable. It turned out to be very much cuttable. The cutting rearranged the world. Naming something after its most important property is a commitment that benefits from more caution than it historically receives. 41. Flames point upward because hot combustion gases are less dense than surrounding cool air and are pushed upward by buoyancy, the same mechanism that makes a heated balloon rise. This is not complicated. Aristotle's explanation was that fire, as one of the four classical elements, naturally seeks its proper place in the celestial realm above the earth, and the flame is simply returning home. This teleological framework, the idea that objects move toward their proper cosmic location rather than in response to physical forces, governed natural philosophical explanation for nearly 2,000 years and was institutionally dominant in European universities through the medieval period and into the early modern era. It was not a lazy explanation. It was a systematically worked out framework that successfully predicted a large number of observable phenomena. Hot things rise, heavy things fall, fire and water behave predictably in relation to each other. The problem was not that it predicted nothing. The problem was that it explained everything through purpose rather than mechanism, making it structurally resistant to the kind of testing that could distinguish correct predictions from coincidental ones. Astronaut candle experiments aboard the International Space Station confirm the buoyancy explanation. Flames in microgravity burn as small, spherical, dim blue balls because without gravity-driven convection, combustion gases have no preferred direction. Aristotle's fire wanted to go home. It turns out there was nowhere to go. 42. René Descartes proposed that the nervous system operated like a hydraulic machine. Refined fluid, called animal spirits, distilled from blood by the brain's ventricles, pumped through hollow nerve tubes to inflate muscles the way a bellows inflates a bladder, producing movement through hydraulic pressure. This was not primitive speculation. It was the most sophisticated mechanical model of neural function available in the 17th century, built on the best engineering analogy Descartes could identify, and it generated testable anatomical predictions. Nerves, if they carried fluid, should be hollow tubes. When anatomists found nerves to be solid, defenders of the hydraulic model argued the channels were simply too fine for available instruments to resolve, a defense that could be maintained indefinitely against any negative evidence produced by instruments of insufficient precision. Luigi Galvani's 1780s experiments showing that electrical stimulation caused muscle contraction in frog legs without any fluid transfer provided the first evidence pointing toward electrochemical conduction, though Galvani initially interpreted his findings in terms of electricity stored in muscle tissue rather than transmitted along nerves. The full electrochemical mechanism of nerve conduction was not mathematically modeled until Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley's 1952 work, for which they received the Nobel Prize. Descartes built a complete working model of your nervous system using hydraulic pumps. The nervous system runs on electrochemistry. The gap between his model and the reality is approximately the distance between a water wheel and a processor. 43. Before nuclear physics existed as a discipline. The obvious explanation for the sun's energy was combustion, an enormous fire burning some fuel, producing light and heat through chemical reaction the way any terrestrial fire does. When combustion was ruled out by the sun's scale and duration, the leading 19th century alternative proposed by Helmholtz and Lord Kelvin was gravitational contraction, the sun slowly shrinking, converting gravitational potential energy into radiated heat. This was a serious, mathematically worked-out hypothesis. It predicted a solar age of roughly 20 to 40 million years. This directly and irreconcilably contradicted geological evidence for Earth's age, which required hundreds of millions of years at minimum, and biological evidence for evolution, which required comparable timescales. Lord Kelvin was so confident in his physical calculation that he publicly and repeatedly dismissed geological and biological evidence as simply wrong. The physics took priority over the field evidence in his assessment. Hans Bethe worked out the proton-proton chain and CNO cycle nuclear fusion reactions in 1939, identifying the actual power source and giving the sun a calculated total lifespan of roughly 10 billion years. The sun runs on a process nobody knew existed until the 20th century. Kelvin calculated the sun's age, got an answer that contradicted two separate scientific fields, and concluded both fields were mistaken. The process he had no knowledge of was running the entire time. 44. The geological consensus before plate tectonics held that mountains were primordial features, formed during the initial cooling and wrinkling of the young Earth, then essentially permanent fixtures of a static planetary surface that had not moved significantly since the planet solidified. The dominant mountain building model taught in geology textbooks into the 1960s was geosyncline theory, which proposed that sediment accumulated in ocean troughs and was somehow elevated by unspecified vertical forces to produce mountain ranges. When Alfred Wegener proposed in 1912 that continents had once been joined and had drifted apart, the geological establishment rejected his hypothesis, not purely out of stubbornness, but because he could not identify a physical mechanism sufficient to move entire continents through solid ocean floor. The mechanism, mantle convection and seafloor spreading, was not confirmed until the 1960s, roughly 30 years after Wegener's death in Greenland. The Himalayas began forming approximately 50 million years ago when the Indian subcontinent collided with Eurasia and are still rising at roughly 5 millimeters per year, measurable with modern GPS. The Appalachian Mountains were once as tall as the modern Himalayas and have eroded over approximately 480 million years to their current modest height. Mountains appear permanent because human lifespans are geologically irrelevant. On a geological timescale, they are temporary surface features on a planet that has not stopped moving since it formed. 45. Copernicus published his heliocentric model in 1543, and the popular narrative presents this as a revolutionary break that immediately swept aside geocentrism, with the Church as the only obstacle standing between the new astronomy and rational acceptance. The actual reception was considerably more complicated, and the Church was not the primary obstacle. The main technical objection to heliocentrism was scientifically legitimate. If Earth orbits the Sun, nearby stars should appear to shift position relative to distant stars over a 6-month period, stellar parallax, and no such shift was observable with 16th century instruments. This was because stars are enormously farther away than anyone then imagined, making the parallax angle too small to detect without telescopes of far greater precision. Stellar parallax was not directly measured until 1838 by Friedrich Bessel, nearly 300 years after Copernicus, meaning the legitimate scientific objection to heliocentrism remained technically unresolved for 3 centuries. Copernicus's book was published with a preface added without his knowledge by editor Andreas Osiander, explicitly framing the heliocentric model as a mathematical convenience rather than a physical description of reality. Tycho Brahe, the greatest observational astronomer of the 16th century, proposed a mathematically coherent compromise in which planets orbit the Sun, but the Sun orbits a stationary Earth, a model that satisfied most available observational evidence at the time. The stars were the actual obstacle. They did not move visibly, and they were not apologetic about it. 46. When telegraph networks expanded rapidly across Europe and North America in the mid-19th century, some physicians and commentators proposed that epidemic diseases could travel along the wires, spreading from city to city through electrical current at the speed of communication itself. The hypothesis was not as absurd as it sounds from a 21st century position. It was a product of genuine confusion about newly discovered electrical phenomena combined with real observation. The disease outbreaks appeared to follow communication and trade corridors with uncanny fidelity. The correlation was accurate. The mechanism was entirely wrong. Disease was traveling by train and by the same trade routes that telegraph lines followed, not through the copper wire. The hypothesis also reflected a broader 19th century anxiety about new technologies, a recurring pattern in which unprecedented speed of information transfer produces speculation that other invisible forces might obey similar rules. The hypothesis never gained serious institutional traction, but circulated in newspaper commentary and minor medical publications, illustrating a reliable principle. When a new technology arrives, it generates a temporary period during which it is blamed or credited for phenomena it has no mechanism to produce. Two things moving along the same corridor are not the same as one thing causing the other. This remains one of the most common errors in causal reasoning, appearing in medical research, social science, and policy discussion with the same consistency it showed in 19th century telegraph coverage. 47. For centuries, natural philosophers explained that flames point upward because fire seeks its celestial home. But they applied the same teleological framework to explain why you experience what you experience. The field of natural philosophy held that living organisms were fundamentally distinguished from non-living matter by a vital force, an immaterial animating principle without which chemistry alone could not produce life. This was vitalism at its foundational level, and it governed biology and medicine as surely as elemental theory governed physics. When Friedrich Wöhler synthesized urea from inorganic materials in 1828, the response from vitalists was not immediate capitulation, but a series of rearguard defenses. Perhaps urea was a special case. Perhaps the simplest organic molecules could be synthesized, but not the complex ones. Perhaps living systems required something beyond chemistry that synthesis merely approximated. Each retreat narrowed the territory where the vital force was required, but the framework survived by continuously relocating its claims to wherever science had not yet reached. This is the defining survival strategy of unfalsifiable theories. They don't make specific predictions that can be tested. They occupy the gaps between current knowledge and complete understanding, and they retreat into the next gap as each prior gap is filled. Vitalism is gone from biology. Its structural logic, retreating to the unexplained rather than making testable predictions, appears regularly in frameworks that replaced it. 48. The belief that acquired characteristics are heritable, covered at its foundational biological level, and its Soviet institutional application in earlier items, also shaped the pseudoscientific racial theories that dominated the late 19th and early 20th centuries in a specific and underexamined way. If organisms can pass characteristics acquired during their lifetimes to offspring, then the characteristics acquired by populations living under certain conditions over generations become inheritable group properties. This extended Lamarckian logic provided one of the theoretical foundations for scientific racism's claim that populations living under conditions of poverty, deprivation, or social marginalization had hereditably acquired the characteristics of those conditions and transmitted them genetically. The framework allowed social circumstances to be reinterpreted as biological destiny. Poverty produced heritable traits of the poor, in this logic, making social hierarchy appear as natural biological order rather than contingent human arrangement. Mendelian genetics, when it arrived, should have demolished this framework by demonstrating that traits segregate, recombine, and express according to inheritance patterns that don't respect acquired characteristics. Instead, the new genetic framework was recruited to support the same conclusions the Lamarckian framework had supported, with different vocabulary. A new scientific framework does not automatically produce new conclusions if the people applying it have not changed the questions they are trying to answer. 49. For most of recorded history, and across independent medical traditions, the brain was not considered the seat of thought, emotion, or personality. Aristotle, whose influence on subsequent intellectual history cannot be overstated, considered the brain a cooling organ for the blood, a biological radiator whose function was thermal regulation rather than cognition. The heart was the seat of the soul, the center of sensation, the organ of thought and feeling. This cardiocentric model was not Aristotle's idiosyncratic position. It was the dominant ancient Greek medical view and competed with brain-centric models for centuries of medical debate. Egyptian mummification practice reflected a similar hierarchy. The heart was preserved carefully in a canopic jar for the afterlife, while the brain was removed through the nasal cavity and discarded as unimportant. Hippocrates and Galen championed the brain as the organ of sensation and intellect, and their view eventually prevailed within Western medicine. But Aristotle's authority was sufficient to keep the debate genuinely contested for far longer than any examination of the evidence should have required. The brain controls virtually every function the cardiocentric model attributed to the heart. The heart is a pump. It is an extraordinarily important pump, and disrupting it will kill you immediately, but its role in generating thought and emotion is precisely zero. Aristotle was confidently wrong about the central organ of human experience. 50. Centuries of Western physicians endorsed the therapeutic use of theriac, a compound remedy sometimes containing dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh, opium, and assorted plant extracts, as a general antidote to poison, a treatment for plague, and a broad-spectrum cure for conditions ranging from infections to chronic illness. The formula was attributed to Mithridates VI of Pontus, a 1st century BCE king who reportedly consumed small quantities of various poisons daily to develop immunity, and later refined by Galen, whose version became the definitive medical authority for over 1,500 years. Theriac was not a folk remedy. It was a prestige medicine manufactured under official supervision in major European cities, sold at premium prices, and prescribed by the most credentialed physicians available. Venice and other cities maintained official production standards and export controls. The preparation process took months. Galen's formulation contained 64 ingredients. For 1,500 years, one of Western medicine's most sophisticated and prestigious treatments was a multi-ingredient compound whose efficacy was never tested against its absence, whose active ingredients were never isolated, and whose continued use was validated entirely by the authority of Galen's name rather than by any evidence of benefit. Theriac is the historical template for what happens when prestige, complexity, and ancient authority substitute for testing. The template has been reused. 51. The sun burns upward in the sky. Heavy things fall toward the ground. Fire seeks the sky. Water seeks the sea. And for nearly 2,000 years, the natural philosophical framework that explained all of these observations held that the universe consisted of 4 fundamental elements: earth, water, fire, and air, each with an intrinsic nature that determined its behavior. This was Aristotle's elemental framework, and it was not simply a placeholder for ignorance. It was a systematically applied theory that generated coherent predictions across a wide range of observable phenomena, and provided the conceptual foundation for alchemy, humoral medicine, meteorology, and cosmology simultaneously. The framework's predictive successes were genuine. Hot things rose, heavy things fell, fire and water didn't mix. The observations were correct. The underlying model was wrong at every level of mechanism. Replacing it required not just better data, but a completely different conception of what a scientific explanation is supposed to do. The shift from teleological explanation, where things behave according to their nature and purpose, to mechanistic explanation, where things behave according to forces and reactions. That shift took roughly 2,000 years to complete and required dismantling phlogiston, caloric, ether, vitalism, and every other invisible substance that the elemental framework spawned in its various disciplinary applications. The 4 elements are gone. Their explanatory descendants took considerably longer to evict. 52. The nervous system operates on electrochemistry, not hydraulic pressure, not animal spirits, and not any variation of invisible fluid running through hollow tubes. But the hydraulic model of neural function wasn't the only wrong framework applied to the brain before electrochemistry arrived. For centuries, the dominant explanation for mental illness held that madness was caused by demonic possession, spiritual corruption, or divine punishment, and treatment followed the diagnostic framework with complete logical consistency. If the cause is spiritual, the treatment is spiritual. Exorcism, prayer, pilgrimage, confession, and in cases where the possession was considered particularly resistant, physical interventions designed to make the body an inhospitable environment for the possessing entity. This included prolonged fasting, extreme cold exposure, and various forms of physical discomfort applied on the theory that demons prefer comfortable hosts. The genuinely instructive part is that some patients improved under these treatments, not because the framework was correct, but because structured attention, reduced isolation, and the placebo response produce real measurable effects regardless of the explanatory system surrounding them. Improvement confirmed the theory. Failure was attributed to insufficient faith or particularly powerful possession. The framework was arranged so that no outcome could contradict it, which is not a property of a scientific theory. It is a property of a belief system, and the distinction matters considerably more in a medical context than in most others. 53. The sun is powered by nuclear fusion, a process nobody knew existed until the 20th century. And before that discovery, the problem of what could possibly sustain the sun's output over geological and biological timescales was a genuine scientific crisis with no satisfactory resolution. Lord Kelvin's gravitational contraction model predicted a solar age incompatible with geology and biology. Chemical combustion was ruled out almost immediately by scale calculations. The crisis exposed a fundamental limitation of 19th century physics. The sun was doing something that the complete inventory of known physical processes could not explain, and the honest response to that situation was to acknowledge the gap rather than conclude that geology and biology were wrong. Kelvin chose the latter. He had the equations, he had the math, and he had the authority. And he used all three to dismiss evidence from fields outside his own for decades. The lesson the scientific community drew from this episode, slowly and imperfectly, was that when a physical calculation produces a result incompatible with evidence from multiple independent fields, the calculation is more likely to be missing something than two entire fields are to be systematically wrong. This lesson has had to be relearned in various forms across the history of science, because the temptation to trust your own calculation over other people's field evidence is apparently very difficult to resist when the calculation is yours. 54. Mountains look permanent. On a human timescale, they effectively are permanent. No mountain range has risen or eroded significantly within recorded human history, and your intuitive sense of geological stability is not wrong for the timescales your life actually operates on. The error is in extending that intuition to timescales 1,000 times longer and assuming it still applies. Before plate tectonics, the geosyncline model of mountain formation proposed vertical forces of unspecified mechanism elevating sediment-filled ocean trenches into ranges, a model that required mysterious forces, and explained neither the specific locations of mountain ranges nor their alignment with volcanic and earthquake activity. Alfred Wegener noticed that the continental coastlines fit together like separated puzzle pieces, compiled geological, fossil, and climatological evidence from multiple continents showing that they had once been joined, proposed a coherent mechanism, and was dismissed by the geological establishment for lacking a sufficiently specified driving force. He died in Greenland in 1930 before the seafloor spreading evidence arrived in the 1960s to confirm his framework. The person who was right about the biggest question in his field died without receiving professional acknowledgement that he was right. The establishment that dismissed him was teaching geosyncline theory in textbooks until the evidence became impossible to ignore. This is not a rare sequence in the history of science. It is common enough to constitute a pattern. 55. The appendix was declared a useless evolutionary vestige, a functionless remnant of a larger cecum used by our herbivorous ancestors, preserved by evolution's inability to eliminate structures that cause no active harm rather than by any positive function. Darwin cited it as evidence for evolution in The Descent of Man, which was a correct use of evolutionary reasoning that unfortunately embedded a specific functional claim that turned out to be premature. The appendix contains significant lymphoid tissue, functionally connected to the immune system, particularly during early development. Multiple independent evolutionary origins of the appendix across mammalian lineages have been identified. It appears to have evolved over 30 separate times across different mammalian groups. Structures that evolve independently more than 30 times are not, as a category, typically functionless vestiges. A 2007 study proposed that the appendix functions as a reservoir for beneficial gut bacteria, allowing reseeding of the intestinal microbiome after it's disrupted by severe illness, an advantage in environments without access to clean water or medical intervention. The broader lesson here applies to the tonsils, adenoids, and several other structures that medicine confidently labeled evolutionary garbage before understanding them. "We haven't found a function" is a statement about the current state of knowledge. "There is no function" is a statement about the organ. Confusing the two has a documented medical history. 56, roughly 98% of the human genome doesn't code for proteins, and when this was discovered, geneticists labeled the non-coding majority junk DNA, implying evolutionary detritus, accumulated errors, and parasitic sequences with no functional significance to the organism carrying them. Susumu Ono coined the term in 1972, and it reflected the state of molecular biology at the time, when protein coding sequences were the only known functional use of genetic material. The ENCODE project published findings in 2012 suggesting that approximately 80% of the human genome shows biochemical activity of some kind, a finding that generated significant academic debate about what functional means, but fundamentally challenged the junk characterization at scale. Long non-coding RNAs, transcribed from regions previously considered junk, have been found to play roles in gene regulation, chromosome inactivation, and cell differentiation. Transposable elements, once called selfish DNA and written off as genomic parasites, have been co-opted for regulatory functions, and some human immune system components appear to derive from ancient transposable element sequences. The genome is not a tidy instruction manual with clearly labeled active regions and inert filler. It is a system of extraordinary complexity whose functional architecture is still being mapped. Calling the parts you haven't understood yet garbage is a conclusion that requires more confidence than incomplete knowledge can support. 57. You use virtually all of your brain. Different regions are active at different times, but no significant portion sits permanently dormant waiting for you to unlock it with the right supplement, technique, or motivational framework. The 10% myth has no identified scientific origin. It has been attributed to William James, to Albert Einstein, and to various early psychologists, and none of these attributions traces to a primary source where any of these people actually made the claim. It may have originated from misinterpretations of early neuroscience findings about neural efficiency or glial cell ratios. Brain imaging studies show activity distributed throughout the brain over the course of a normal day. The metabolic argument alone should settle it. Your brain consumes approximately 20% of your body's total energy, despite being roughly 2% of your body weight. No organism evolves to maintain a metabolically expensive organ at 90% idle capacity across its entire lifespan. Evolution eliminates unused structures. The appendix was nearly eliminated on the false assumption that it was unused, and it has not eliminated 90% of the brain. Brain injuries demonstrate the opposite of the myth. Damage to virtually any brain region produces specific, identifiable functional deficits. If 90% were unused, most brain injuries would be inconsequential. They are not. The myth has no origin, no evidence, and directly contradicts the observable consequences of brain damage. 58. Albert Einstein did not fail mathematics as a child. This is worth stating clearly because the myth is repeated constantly as an inspirational anecdote and is factually backward in the direction that matters most. Einstein's school records survive and show strong performance in mathematics and physics. He reported in autobiographical writings that he had mastered calculus by age 15. His 1966 school-leaving certificate shows the maximum grade in mathematics and physics under the Swiss grading system, where 6 is the highest mark and 1 is the lowest. The confusion appears to trace to this grading system being misread by someone unfamiliar with it. A report showing Einstein receiving 6s in mathematics was interpreted as a failing grade by someone accustomed to a system where lower numbers indicate higher performance. Einstein did fail the entrance examination to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic on his first attempt at age 15, applying 2 years younger than the normal candidate age, with documented weakness in French and botany rather than mathematics. The professor who examined him encouraged him to reapply the following year and praised his mathematical knowledge specifically. The actual Einstein story gifted student excels in mathematics and eventually rewrites physics, is less useful to the inspiration industry than the inverted version. The inverted version spread because it felt true. Feeling true and being true are different measurements. 59. The Great Wall of China is not visible from space with the naked eye. The claim appears in print as early as 1932 in Ripley's Believe It or Not, predating spaceflight by decades. It was a claim about what would theoretically be visible from a hypothetical future vantage point, not an observation, and it was wrong on the physics before anyone had gone to space to test it. The wall is roughly 4 to 9 meters wide. Visual resolution from low Earth orbit at approximately 400 kilometers altitude requires objects to be significantly wider than that to resolve against terrain of similar color and texture. Highways and airports are visible from orbit because they are wide and contrast with their surroundings. The Great Wall is neither wide enough nor sufficiently contrasting with the Chinese landscape to be resolved by an unaided human eye from that distance. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei specifically attempted to see the Great Wall during his 2003 mission, could not locate it, and stated this publicly, creating a moment of national sensitivity in China, where the claim had been repeated in school textbooks for generations and had become a point of cultural pride. A physically impossible claim was published in 1932, taught in textbooks for 70 years, and tested when humanity reached space. The wall failed the test. The textbooks continued circulating. 60. Seasons are caused by Earth's axial tilt, not by variation in Earth's distance from the Sun. Earth is actually slightly closer to the Sun in January, northern hemisphere winter, than in July, which is the opposite of what the distance model would predict. The orbital variation is approximately 3% between closest and farthest approach, insufficient to drive the temperature differences observed between seasons, and in the wrong direction for the northern hemisphere, where the myth most commonly circulates. The axial tilt of approximately 23.5 degrees means that during summer, the hemisphere tilted toward the sun receives sunlight at a higher angle, more energy per unit of surface area, and for more hours per day. Both effects independently produce warming. The tilt explanation also correctly predicts why the northern and southern hemispheres have opposite seasons simultaneously, which the distance model cannot account for at all, since the whole Earth would be closer to or farther from the Sun at the same time. Philip Sadler's research at Harvard found that 21 of 23 graduating seniors interviewed on camera could not correctly explain what causes seasons. These were people who had completed undergraduate education at one of the world's most selective universities. The correct answer requires understanding angles of incidence. The wrong answer, we're closer in summer, is immediately compelling and immediately wrong. The most intuitive explanation for a natural phenomenon is the one that most rewards skeptical examination. 61. Glass is an amorphous solid. It does not flow at room temperature on any timescale relevant to human civilization, to recorded history, or to any future point at which the objects currently made of glass will still exist in recognizable form. The viscosity of glass at room temperature is approximately 10 to the 23rd Pascal seconds, a number so large that flowing any measurable distance would require longer than the current age of the universe. The thickness variation observed in old cathedral windows and antique glass panes reflects manufacturing methods, not gravitational flow. Medieval and Renaissance glass was made by the crown glass method, which involved spinning molten glass into a disc that was naturally thicker at the edges. When cut into window panes, these pieces were installed with the heavier end downward for structural stability. A glazier's practical decision, not a product of centuries of slow creep. Egyptian glass beads and Roman glass vessels thousands of years old retain uniform thickness, providing direct empirical evidence that ancient glass has not flowed measurably over millennia in conditions far older than any cathedral window. The myth transforms an interesting fact about manufacturing technique into a claim that your windows are quietly oozing downward right now. They are not. Glass is not going anywhere. It is, in a meaningful physical sense, the opposite of going anywhere. 62. Napoleon Bonaparte was approximately average height for a French man of his era, roughly 5 feet 6 or 7 inches in modern measurement. The famous short Napoleon is a product of a unit conversion error, deliberate wartime propaganda, and a confusion between two men who happened to share a name. Napoleon's height was recorded as 5 pieds 2 pouces in French units. The French pouce was longer than the English inch, and the conversion produced a 5'2" figure that spread through English sources as literal measurement rather than a mistranslated one. British caricaturist James Gilray's wartime cartoons depicted Napoleon as a tiny, temperamental man dwarfed by larger British figures. Deliberate propaganda that proved extraordinarily durable as a cultural image precisely because it was repeated during the period when most English-speaking people were forming their understanding of who Napoleon was. Napoleon's Imperial Guard had a minimum height requirement of 5 feet 8 inches, and the visual contrast between Napoleon and his significantly taller guards in contemporary accounts may have contributed to impressions of relative smallness. The Napoleon complex entered psychology as the term for aggressive behavior compensating for small physical stature, named after a man who was not actually small, making it one of psychology's more structurally embarrassing eponyms. The most famous short person in popular history was not short. 63. When bubonic plague swept through Europe in the 14th century and killed roughly a third of the population in several years, the medical faculty of the University of Paris, Europe's most prestigious medical institution, issued an official explanation attributing the catastrophe to a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, which they calculated had corrupted the air at a fundamental level. This was the establishment's authoritative scientific answer to the worst pandemic in European history. The celestial bodies were not involved. The flea on the rat in your grain store was involved. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium Plasmodium pestis carried by flea bites, was the mechanism, and it operated completely independently of planetary positions. The miasmatic and astrological explanations generated responses that were useless at best. Burning aromatic herbs, astrological consultation, flagellant processions moving infected people between communities. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells and massacred across Europe, partly because their communities showed slightly lower plague mortality, likely due to religious hygiene practices reducing flea exposure, which was interpreted as evidence of deliberate poisoning rather than differential vector contact. Alexandre Yersin identified the plague bacterium in 1897. The flea transmission mechanism was confirmed in 1898. This was approximately 550 years after the Black Death. Europe's best medical institution blamed the planets. The fleas continued working. 64. Benjamin Franklin's lightning rod is commonly misunderstood as a device that attracts lightning strikes and channels them harmlessly to the ground, volunteering to be struck so the building beneath it doesn't have to be. This framing reverses the primary mechanism. Franklin's original design called for pointed metal tips, specifically because he believed they would silently discharge atmospheric electricity continuously, reducing the electrical potential difference between the structure and the clouds, and thereby preventing strikes from accumulating in the first place. The competing design favored in Britain used blunt-tipped rods, partly for political reasons during the American Revolutionary period. Franklin was a colonial revolutionary, and British scientific institutions declined to adopt his pointed design as a matter of institutional preference, independent of the physics. The pointed versus blunt debate became simultaneously politically charged and scientifically substantive, with the two dimensions hopelessly entangled in contemporary discussion. Churches initially resisted lightning rods on theological grounds. If God sends lightning as judgment, constructing a device to deflect it is an act of impiety. Church bell towers continued to be struck. The people ringing the bells during storms to ward off lightning were particularly vulnerable, since the standard protective practice put them inside the structure being struck at the moment of maximum risk. The theological argument against lightning protection had measurable human consequences, and the humans bearing those consequences were not the ones making the theological argument. 65. Antibiotics kill bacteria. They have no mechanism of action against viruses, no effect on viral replication, and no capacity to shorten the duration of a cold, influenza, or any other viral infection regardless of dose, duration, or the sincerity of the patient requesting them. This distinction was scientifically understood from the beginning of the antibiotic era. It was not communicated effectively to patients, not enforced consistently by prescribing physicians under patient pressure, and not prioritized as a public health concern until the consequences had accumulated into a crisis. The World Health Organization estimates that antimicrobial resistance currently causes approximately 1,270,000 deaths annually as a direct result, with projections suggesting this could reach 10 million per year by 2050 if current trends continue. Antibiotic resistance evolves through natural selection. Bacteria exposed to antibiotics and not killed carry heritable resistance characteristics, reproduce, and pass resistance forward. The more antibiotics are used, including in conditions where they cannot possibly help, the faster and more completely resistance develops across the bacterial populations you actually need antibiotics to treat. Decades of prescribing the wrong medicine for the wrong disease produced a global public health crisis in the bacteria that weren't the target. The viral infections didn't respond. The bacteria that were exposed did. The selection pressure was applied to the wrong organism, and the wrong organism adapted. 66 different cell types in your body have vastly different lifespans, ranging from days to a lifetime. And the 7-year complete replacement figure applies to no specific tissue, describes no real biological process, and corresponds to no identified mechanism. Gut lining cells turn over every 2 to 5 days. Red blood cells last approximately 120 days. Skin cells turn over every 2 to 4 weeks. Neurons in your cerebral cortex are largely formed before birth and persist for your entire lifetime without replacement. You have been thinking with substantially the same cortical neurons since early childhood, and those neurons carry the accumulated history of your experience in their connection patterns, rather than being refreshed on any schedule. Carbon-14 dating of human cells, using atmospheric carbon-14 from Cold War nuclear weapons testing as an inadvertent biological timestamp, has allowed researchers to determine actual birth dates for specific cell populations and confirmed extremely variable turnover rates across tissue types. The heart was long believed to have no regenerative capacity at all. Research in the 2000s found that cardiac muscle cells do replace themselves, but at approximately 1% per year, meaning only about 40% of your heart muscle cells are replaced over a full lifetime. You are not a new person every 7 years. Some of your neurons have been running continuously since before you could form a sentence. The rest of your body is on its own schedule, which nobody asked. 67. Evolution has no direction, no destination, and no preference for complexity over simplicity. Natural selection favors whatever survives and reproduces in a given environment, which is as likely to mean losing structures as gaining them. Parasitic organisms routinely evolve dramatic simplification, discarding eyes, limbs, digestive systems, and immune components that their free-living ancestors possessed, because maintaining unused complexity costs energy and natural selection eliminates unnecessary metabolic expense. Bacteria constitute the vast majority of Earth's biomass, have survived every mass extinction that eliminated more complex life forms, and have been the dominant life form on this planet for approximately 3.5 billion years. They are not failed precursors to you. They are the most successful organisms in the history of the planet by any metric other than complexity. And complexity is a metric you selected specifically because it ranks you highly. Stephen Jay Gould argued that what appears to be evolutionary progress toward complexity is largely a statistical artifact. Life started simple because it couldn't start complex. So random variation produces more complexity over time, while the modal form of life, measured by diversity, biomass, and persistence, remains microbial throughout Earth's history. The popular image of evolution as a progressive march from bacteria to humans, with humans at the apex, is a diagram you drew about yourself. The bacteria were not consulted and would rank the results differently. 68, the far side of the moon receives exactly as much sunlight as the near side, on a schedule you can observe from Earth as the lunar phases cycle through new and full moon each month. During new moon, the far side is fully illuminated, while the near side faces Earth in darkness. During full moon, the situation is reversed. The far side is not in permanent shadow. It is not lightless. It is not dark in any physical sense. It is dark only in the sense that it was unknown, hidden from Earth observation by tidal locking, which keeps the same lunar hemisphere permanently facing Earth, while the other hemisphere permanently faces away. The Soviet Luna 3 spacecraft photographed the far side for the first time in 1959, revealing a surface dramatically different from the near side. Fewer large volcanic plains, more heavy cratering, a genuine and significant scientific discovery. The cultural confusion between facing away from Earth and facing away from the sun has since been reinforced by popular music, casual usage, and the poetic appeal of permanent darkness as a metaphor for the unknowable. The far side of the moon is not unknowable. Spacecraft have mapped it in detail. It gets sunlight every 2 weeks. Calling it dark is a geographical statement about its relationship to Earth's perspective, which someone along the way rephrased as a statement about its relationship to the sun. Those are different stars in different sentences. 69, goldfish have demonstrated memory retention spanning months in controlled laboratory conditions. They can learn to navigate mazes, anticipate feeding schedules, associate specific signals with food delivery, and according to some studies, recognize individual human faces across repeated interactions. The 3-second memory figure has no scientific origin that anyone has successfully traced to a primary source. It has been attributed to various researchers and institutions, and none of these attributions leads to an actual study establishing a 3-second goldfish memory span, because no such study appears to exist. The claim circulates as established biology in casual conversation, appears in popular reference books, and gets repeated with the confident specificity of a measured result. Phil Zippel's work at the University of Plymouth trained goldfish to press levers for food and found retention across multi-month periods. A commonly cited experiment involved training goldfish to press a lever that released food only during a 1-hour window each day. The fish learned to press the lever primarily during the feeding window, demonstrating time-based memory operating on a daily cycle. A number nobody can trace to a source, attributed to a species that demonstrably contradicts it in controlled conditions, became one of the most repeated animal facts in popular culture. The goldfish remembered its feeding schedule. The humans forgot to check whether the fact was real. 70. The medieval period did not produce 1,000 years of intellectual stagnation between classical antiquity and Renaissance enlightenment. The Dark Ages narrative was coined by Renaissance humanist Francesco Petrarch, specifically to contrast his era favorably with everything that preceded it. A self-serving characterization by a movement that had strong professional and rhetorical reasons to present itself as a rebirth after darkness. Ibn al-Haytham produced foundational work in optics and the experimental method in the 11th century. Al-Biruni conducted geodesic measurements and geological observations of comparable sophistication in the same period. Ibn Sina's Systematic Medical Encyclopedia remained a standard European medical reference into the 17th century. These are not peripheral figures. They are among the most important scientists in the relevant fields across any era, and the Dark Ages narrative renders them invisible by defining the period as dark, and then defining dark as the absence of the kind of scholarship they were producing. European medieval figures, including Roger Bacon, Robert Grosseteste, and Jean Buridan, made substantive contributions to experimental method, optics, and mechanics respectively. Gothic cathedrals required practical engineering knowledge of structural mechanics that does not appear spontaneously in a civilization doing no intellectual work. The medieval period was full of things happening. The Renaissance simply preferred a narrative in which it had invented thinking. 71. Humans did not evolve from chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are not your ancestors. They are something closer to extremely distant cousins, species that share a common ancestor with your lineage, with that shared ancestor having lived approximately 6 to 7 million years ago, and that ancestor being neither a modern human nor a modern chimpanzee. Both lineages descended from a now extinct population and diverged along separate evolutionary paths over millions of years. The fossil record between that common ancestor and Homo sapiens contains numerous hominin species: Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and others, none of which were chimpanzees or chimpanzee ancestors. The misunderstanding is the most reliably exploited misrepresentation in anti-evolutionary argument. If humans evolved from chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees? The answer is that the premise is wrong. No living species is the ancestor of another living species in the relevant sense. Genetic comparison shows approximately 98.7% DNA sequence similarity between humans and chimpanzees, reflecting recent common ancestry rather than descent. Your actual ancestors are extinct, which is why you cannot interview them about the relationship. The confusion between related to and descended from has generated more rhetorical mileage from a single biological misunderstanding than perhaps any other error in the public understanding of science. 72. Controlled studies examining the relationship between full moon phases and human behavior, psychiatric admissions, emergency room visits, crime rates, accident statistics, suicide rates, consistently find no correlation above random variation. The belief persists among emergency room staff, police officers, and psychiatric workers with such tenacity that it has been studied not just as a behavioral claim, but as a psychological phenomenon in its own right. Ivan Kelly, James Rotten, and Roger Culver reviewed over 100 studies examining lunar effects on human behavior in 1986 and found no consistent, replicable correlation. Their analysis has been replicated in subsequent meta-analyses, reaching the same conclusion. The mechanism by which the full moon belief sustains itself is confirmation bias operating in a specific direction. Medical staff who believe in the full moon unconsciously attribute unusual events to the moon on full moon nights, and attribute equally unusual events to ordinary causes on other nights. The events are equally unusual throughout the month. The moon is more noticeable on full moon nights because it is significantly brighter, which means you are more likely to look up, notice it, and associate whatever is happening around you with what you just noticed overhead. The full moon is very bright. Emergency rooms are consistently chaotic. These two facts have been combined into a causal relationship that the data has declined to confirm. 73 double-blind controlled studies have found no relationship between sugar intake and children's behavior or attentiveness. In one particularly direct experiment, parents who were told their child had received sugar when the child had actually received an artificial sweetener rated their child as significantly more hyperactive than parents correctly informed their child had received no sugar. The children's behavior was identical. The parents' perception of their children's behavior changed based on what they believed their children had consumed. Mark Wohlreich's studies published in the Journal of the American Medical Association and the New England Journal of Medicine in the 1990s gave children either sugar or a placebo, and found no behavioral differences in any measured category. The association between sugar and children's excited behavior is real but causal in the opposite direction. Children consume sugar at events that independently produce excitement. Birthday parties, holidays, celebrations, disrupted routines, unusual social gatherings, and the sugar correlates with the excitement without causing it. The belief is so robust among parents that presenting them with the experimental evidence rarely changes their position, making it one of the more studied examples of belief persistence in the face of direct contradicting evidence. Your child is excited at the birthday party because it is a birthday party. The cake is participating in the celebration. It is not running the experiment. 74. Neanderthals had brains as large as or larger than anatomically modern humans by volume, buried their dead, produced art, used pigments for body decoration, made jewelry from shells and animal teeth, cared for injured and elderly group members who could not have survived without support, and interbred with Homo sapiens extensively enough that 1 to 4% of the DNA in most living people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa derives from Neanderthal lineage. The brutish, stooped, dim-witted image of Neanderthals derives substantially from the 1908 reconstruction of the Old Man of La Chapelle-aux-Saints by Marceline Boule, who interpreted the severe osteoarthritis visible in the skeleton as normal Neanderthal anatomy, and produced a pathologically bent posture that was then presented as the species type for decades of subsequent illustration and popular understanding. The individual he was studying had severe joint disease. Boule reconstructed it as a healthy specimen. Svante Pääbo's team published the first Neanderthal genome draft in 2010, confirming interbreeding with modern humans at a scale that required sustained contact rather than isolated encounters. Shell ornaments colored with ochre and perforated for wearing, attributed to Neanderthals, have been dated to approximately 115,000 years ago, predating the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe. Some of the descendants of those ornament makers are reading this sentence right now. 75. Aristotle counted 5 senses in approximately 350 BCE, and the number entered educational curricula, remained there for roughly 2,400 years, and is still the number most people would give if asked unprompted. Proprioception, your sense of where your body parts are in space without looking at them, is a distinct sensory system with identifiable receptors, dedicated neural pathways, and catastrophic consequences when it fails. People who lose functional proprioception through peripheral neuropathy cannot walk without watching their feet at all times, cannot reach accurately for objects without visual guidance, and lose the ability to perform any coordinated movement that takes place outside their visual field. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a profound disability produced by the loss of a sense that Aristotle's framework didn't enumerate. The vestibular system provides balance and acceleration information through structures in the inner ear anatomically separate from the hearing apparatus. Thermoception, nociception, and interoception are additional distinct sensory modalities with separate receptor types and neural pathways. The actual number of human senses depends on how you define sense and how finely you subdivide the category, but it is certainly higher than 5 by any reasonable biological criterion. 5 is a satisfyingly round number. Proprioception doesn't care about round numbers and will demonstrate its existence the next time you try to walk in complete darkness. 76. Newton's gravitational theory was the product of roughly 20 years of mathematical development, culminating in the Principia Mathematica of 1687, not a moment of sudden complete inspiration following contact with a falling piece of fruit. The apple story derives primarily from William Stukeley's 1752 memoir, written decades after the supposed event. Newton told Stukeley that seeing an apple fall prompted contemplation about gravity. The story describes contemplation, not discovery, And the specific detail that the apple struck Newton on the head appears to be a later embellishment that doesn't appear in the versions Newton himself told. Robert Hooke corresponded with Newton about the inverse square law of gravitation before Newton's Principia was published, and the priority dispute between them was sustained and bitter. The kind of dispute that does not arise when one party independently derives an entire framework from scratch after a single accidental encounter with fruit. The gravitational theory was developed within specific mathematical and astronomical context, in response to specific problems in celestial mechanics, over a period of years. Science actually works through sustained, difficult, unglamorous effort that is hard to depict in a diagram. The apple story compresses decades of mathematics into a moment of arboreal accident because that version fits on a motivational poster. Both things are true, and only one of them is accurate. 77. Lemmings do not commit mass suicide. This behavior does not occur in nature. The famous footage of lemmings running off a cliff was filmed for a 1958 Disney documentary called White Wilderness, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature, and it was staged. Lemmings were purchased from Inuit children in Manitoba, transported to Alberta, where the species does not naturally live, herded toward a riverbank using a rotating platform, and filmed being pushed into the water. The documentary presented the resulting footage as a natural behavior it had captured in the wild. Real lemming population cycles do involve periodic mass migrations when local food resources are exceeded by population density. During these migrations, lemmings can drown crossing bodies of water they misjudge. Accidental death produced by navigation error during a genuine population movement, not coordinated suicidal behavior. The myth predated the Disney film in Norse folklore and earlier accounts, but the documentary footage cemented the suicide narrative in 20th century culture with visual specificity that proved impossible to dislodge. Karl Barks drew Donald Duck comic strips featuring suicidal lemmings in 1955, before the documentary aired, suggesting the cultural myth was already in circulation waiting for visual confirmation. The behavior doesn't exist. The Academy Award exists. The metaphor built from the behavior has appeared in business literature, psychology, and political commentary for 70 years without the underlying event having ever occurred. 78. The medical belief that semen contained vital, life-giving properties whose conservation was essential to male health and whose loss caused measurable physical and mental deterioration shaped clinical practice, dietary recommendations, and institutional treatment of patients in ways that produced real documented harm across the 19th and early 20th centuries. John Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of cornflakes, was a prominent advocate who explicitly connected his dietary recommendations to semen conservation theory, believing that bland foods reduced the sexual appetite responsible for dangerous seminal loss, and that masturbation caused a specific catalog of physical and mental diseases. The concept of semen as a vital essence appears independently in ancient Greek medical texts, Ayurvedic tradition, and classical Chinese medicine. Multiple civilizations converging on the same wrong conclusion from similar observations about reproduction and perceived male vitality. Victorian physicians diagnosed spermatorrhea, a condition consisting of involuntary semen loss causing weakness and mental deterioration, and treated it with devices designed to prevent nocturnal emissions, some of which caused physical injury. Semen contains primarily water, fructose, proteins, and enzymes in quantities too small to carry nutritional significance. It has no documented pharmacological properties supporting any medical treatment claim made on its behalf. Cornflakes were invented as a dietary intervention against a fictional disease. This is the strangest sentence in this entire video, and it is completely accurate. 79. Real drowning is almost entirely silent and nearly motionless. The drowning person of film and television, arms waving, head bobbing dramatically, calling for help, is performing a behavior that a person who is actually drowning is physiologically incapable of producing. Frank Paya described the instinctive drowning response in 1974 after years of lifeguard observation. A drowning person's body automatically extends arms laterally and pushes downward to keep the mouth above the water surface. There is no capacity to wave, signal, or call for help because every available motor response is consumed by the involuntary effort to maintain the airway. The mouth alternates between just above and just below the surface in a cycle too rapid to permit simultaneous breathing and calling. Drowning typically takes 20 to 60 seconds for an adult and can occur in as little as 20 to 30 seconds for a child. This is faster than most bystanders recognize and respond to, particularly when they are watching for the arm waving and screaming that signal danger in every film depiction of drowning they have ever seen. The training people receive from decades of dramatic drowning scenes creates a specific perceptual blind spot. The quiet, vertical, arms down person in the water who is actually drowning can be standing in this position within meters of observers who are waiting for a completely different set of signals. Fiction trained the wrong response. The water does not care which response you learned. 80. The Coriolis effect is real, significant at planetary scales, and completely irrelevant to the direction water spins in your sink or toilet. The effect influences hurricane rotation, counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere, clockwise in the southern, ocean current patterns, and long-range ballistic trajectories, because these are phenomena operating over hundreds of kilometers and hours of time. In a typical residential sink or toilet, the Coriolis force is approximately 10 million times weaker than the other forces determining which direction the water drains, the geometry of the basin, the initial motion imparted when water entered, and minor asymmetries in the drain itself. Asher Shapiro at MIT and Lloyd Trefethen in Sydney conducted parallel careful experiments in 1962 and 1965 in opposite hemispheres and demonstrated a Coriolis effect in water drainage, but only under conditions of extraordinary experimental control, requiring water to sit completely undisturbed for more than 24 hours in a perfectly symmetrical basin with no initial rotation. Tourist demonstrations at the equator in countries including Kenya and Ecuador, showing water switching rotational direction as a basin is carried across the equatorial line, are staged. The demonstrators control the drain direction manually by the position of their hands on the container. The physics exists. The sink demonstration is theater. They involve water and share no other meaningful relationship. 81. Einstein was an excellent student who found rote memorization tedious and clashed with authoritarian pedagogical styles, and this accurate but partial description was compressed, inverted, and repackaged into the myth of comprehensive academic failure, because the inspirational industry requires stories of early struggle preceding late recognition, and found the actual Einstein narrative insufficiently dramatic. His 1966 school-leaving certificate shows the maximum available grade in mathematics and physics under the Swiss grading system. He reported mastering calculus at age 15. His failure of the ETH entrance examination in 1895 occurred when he was 15 years old, applying 2 years younger than the standard candidate age, with documented weakness in French and botany specifically, not in the subjects that mattered for his subsequent career. The professor who examined him praised his mathematical knowledge and encouraged him to reapply the following year. Einstein's subsequent difficulty finding academic employment derived primarily from a specific conflict with one professor at ETH whose recommendations he needed and did not receive. A bureaucratic and interpersonal obstacle, not evidence of intellectual inadequacy recognized by a broad institutional consensus. The myth spread because it felt true and served a purpose. Gifted student excels in his subjects, finds one professor difficult, struggles with job applications, and then rewrites physics is the accurate sequence. It has never appeared on a motivational poster because it describes a career that looks familiar rather than miraculous. 82. Iron Maidens, the human-shaped spike-lined cabinets depicted in horror films, displayed in museum collections, and cited in accounts of medieval torture, were largely assembled in the 18th and 19th centuries from unrelated artifacts by museum curators and collectors seeking dramatic display pieces, and were not used as torture devices in the medieval period. The most famous example, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, is considered by contemporary scholarship to have been assembled from parts of different historical objects in the early 19th century, rather than manufactured as a single functional device. Medieval torture methods are extensively documented in surviving legal records, interrogation manuals, ecclesiastical proceedings, and contemporary accounts. Iron Maidens do not appear in this documentation, which is a significant absence for a device that would have been remarkable enough to describe in any record-keeping system that documented less dramatic implements. The cultural fascination with medieval torture was partly a product of 18th and 19th century Romanticism, which projected Gothic horror onto the medieval past with considerable enthusiasm and insufficient historical verification. Some anthropomorphic reliquaries, containers shaped like human figures used to hold religious relics, may have contributed visual source material that was later modified or misidentified. The medieval period had genuine horrors, documented in detail. The Iron Maiden was manufactured by the era that was most interested in believing the medieval period was uniquely barbaric. 83. The Great Fire of London did not end the Great Plague of London. The plague was already declining before the fire occurred. The fire burned primarily the city of London within the old walls, while the plague's highest concentrations had been in the poorer parishes outside those walls, which the fire largely did not reach, and plague returned to England in smaller outbreaks after 1666, including documented cases in 1667, contradicting the narrative at its most basic factual level. The Great Plague of 1665 killed an estimated 100,000 Londoners, roughly a quarter of the city's population, and was already substantially declining by late 1665 and early 1666, months before the September fire. The narrative of accidental benefit, catastrophe producing unexpected cleansing, is emotionally satisfying in the specific way that meaningful historical coincidence always is. Where two dramatic events occurring in sequence imply a causal connection that the evidence does not support. The actual decline of plague in Western Europe in the late 17th century is attributed to multiple factors, including changes in the dominant rat species composition and possible changes in the bacterium's virulence. Complex, gradual, undramatic causes that do not make a good story. History is under no obligation to be thematically tidy. The fire burned. The plague was already leaving. These were separate events that shared a city and a decade. 84. Blood is never blue inside your body. Deoxygenated blood is dark red, a deeper, more maroon shade than oxygenated arterial blood, but red throughout. Hemoglobin, the oxygen-carrying protein in red blood cells, exists in two forms: oxyhemoglobin, which is bright red, and deoxyhemoglobin, which is dark red. Neither form is blue. Neither form has ever been blue at any point in the cardiovascular circuit, including in the deep venous system returning blood to the lungs. The blue appearance of veins visible through skin is produced by an optical phenomenon. Red light wavelengths penetrate deeper into tissue and are absorbed by surrounding structures, while blue light wavelengths are reflected more readily from the surface, making subcutaneous veins appear blue regardless of what color the blood inside them actually is. This is a property of skin and light, not a property of blood. Medical personnel drawing blood from veins, which contain deoxygenated blood. Observe dark red blood every time, because that is what comes out, because that is what it is. You can confirm this yourself the next time you receive a minor cut, since your blood will be red immediately upon exiting your body, without any opportunity to encounter the oxygen that supposedly turns it red. The blood has been red the whole time. The veins looked blue. These are different observations about different things. 85 non-avian dinosaurs went extinct approximately 66 million years ago. The earliest members of the genus Homo appeared approximately 2 to 3 million years ago. The temporal gap between the last non-avian dinosaur and the first human is roughly 63 million years, a duration longer than the entire span of the age of dinosaurs from their first appearance to their extinction. The intuitive compression of deep time into a vague category of long ago produces a mental timeline in which prehistoric things exist in rough proximity to each other, placing cave paintings, dinosaurs, and early mammals in a loosely shared past that actual chronology separates by tens of millions of years. The entire span from the first dinosaurs approximately 230 million years ago to their extinction 66 million years ago is roughly 165 million years, a duration within which the whole of human evolutionary history represents a recent and minor fraction. Birds are technically avian dinosaurs and did coexist with humans and still do, which means the claim is technically true in a sense that is not the culturally intended one. A 2012 survey found that approximately 25% of Americans believed humans and dinosaurs coexisted. Deep time is genuinely difficult for human intuition to process accurately. The Flintstones was a cartoon. It was not intended as a timeline. The timeline it implied has nonetheless proven more durable in popular understanding than the actual sequence of events. 86. Most birds have a poorly developed sense of smell and cannot detect human scent in any way that would trigger offspring rejection. The childhood instruction not to touch fallen baby birds because the mother will smell your hands and abandon the chick has no biological foundation. In the species most commonly found fallen from nests, songbirds, whose olfactory systems are limited and whose parental recognition of offspring operates through visual and auditory cues rather than scent. The evolutionary logic argues against the myth with particular force. Parental investment in eggs and chicks is metabolically expensive, representing weeks of energy expenditure in incubation, feeding, and protection. Abandoning offspring over casual human contact would be strongly selected against, since incidental human proximity does not reliably predict nest failure or sustained threat. Wildlife rehabilitators handle chicks for medical assessment, treatment, and transport routinely, and return them to nests or parent birds without observing elevated rejection rates. Direct professional observation, accumulated over decades, that directly contradicts the myth in the specific conditions the myth addresses. Exceptions exist in the biological record. Vultures and certain seabirds have well-developed olfactory systems. These are not the birds most commonly found on the ground beneath suburban trees. Generations of children walked past fallen chicks based on advice with no biological foundation, delivered with complete parental confidence by adults who had received the same advice from adults who had no idea why either. 87. The human body is approximately 60% water by mass, and this fact has functioned in popular science communication as a complete and somehow satisfying description of human biochemistry rather than as a single measurement that tells you almost nothing about the system being measured. The human proteome contains an estimated 20,000 to 25,000 distinct proteins, with many more variants produced through alternative splicing and chemical modification after translation. The human microbiome contains approximately 38 trillion microbial cells, roughly equal to the number of human cells by count, meaning the human body is, in terms of cellular population, approximately half microbial, and the biochemical contributions of those microbial inhabitants to human metabolism, immune function, and neurological signaling are still being characterized. Human cells contain mitochondria with their own separate genome, derived from an ancient bacterial endosymbiosis approximately 1.5 billion years ago. You contain organelles that were once independent bacteria and still carry bacterial DNA distinct from your nuclear genome. The Human Protein Atlas, the Human Cell Atlas, and related mapping projects are producing descriptions of biological complexity that make the 60% water figure look like describing a library by noting it is mostly paper. Both statements are accurate. Neither one tells you what is actually there or what it does. 88. Marco Polo did not introduce pasta to Italy from China. A 1279 Italian document, predating Marco Polo's return from China in 1295, references a basket of macaroni in a Genoese soldier's estate inventory, placing pasta in Italy before the supposed introduction by 16 years at minimum. The Marco Polo pasta origin story appears to trace to a 1929 article in the Macaroni Journal, a trade publication with no medieval source attributing pasta's European presence to Marco Polo's travels. European and Asian noodle traditions most likely developed independently, given the basic simplicity of flour and water dough as a culinary technology and the absence of any mechanism requiring a single point of introduction for something as elementary as boiled grain paste. Marco Polo's own accounts of Chinese cuisine do not include any indication that he found noodles novel or surprising compared to food he knew from home. An omission that would be conspicuous if he were encountering pasta for the first time in China, and later credited with its introduction to Italy. A trade publication invented an origin story for its industry's product in 1929. The story spread through a century of food writing and school curricula, and Marco Polo traveled to China from a country that already had pasta, which he apparently did not find remarkable enough to mention. 89. Shaving has no effect on hair thickness, color, or growth rate. The follicle determines all of these characteristics, and the follicle is below the skin surface, biologically unaffected by what happens to the hair shaft above it. Mildred Trotter's controlled study in 1928 found no effect of repeated shaving on hair character including color, rate of growth, or cross-sectional thickness. One of the earlier careful examinations of the claim, published nearly a century ago. Multiple subsequent controlled studies confirmed the finding. The myth has been specifically addressed in dermatological literature precisely because it is so widespread and so resistant to correction despite the availability of direct contrary evidence. The perceptual basis for the belief is real. Freshly cut hair has a blunt cross-section, rather than the tapered tip that natural uncut hair develops, and blunt-cut hair feels coarser and appears darker because the full shaft diameter is visible rather than the narrowing end. As the hair grows, this effect diminishes, and the hair returns to its natural apparent texture. The myth has been formally disproven since 1928 and is still told to teenagers preparing to shave for the first time. The refuting evidence is a century old and was not particularly difficult to generate. The myth persists because the tactile effect is real, and the correct explanation is less interesting than the wrong one. 90. The tongue map, showing sweet detection at the tip, salty and sour on the sides, and bitter at the back, was a standard feature of biology textbooks for decades, and is wrong in its basic claim that different taste qualities are detected by spatially discrete zones. All taste receptor types are distributed across the entire tongue surface. The map appears to derive from a 1901 paper by German scientist D.P. Honig, which described subtle regional variations in taste sensitivity, not discrete zones with exclusive function, and was subsequently mistranslated and misrepresented in an English source that became the basis for textbook illustrations reproduced without verification for roughly a century. Virginia Collings's 1974 study re-examined Hanig's original data and found that all taste qualities could be detected across the entire tongue surface, with only minor variations in threshold that bore no resemblance to the discrete zone map in circulation. The map remained in American biology textbooks well into the 1990s, despite being contradicted by an experiment anyone could perform by placing different taste substances on different tongue areas. A fifth basic taste, umami, was proposed by Japanese chemist Kikunai Ikeda in 1908 and accepted into Western scientific consensus only in the late 20th century, meaning the five-taste model underlying the map was itself incomplete, while the map was still being printed and distributed in classrooms. 91 anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, with essentially the same brain architecture and cognitive capacity as contemporary people, existed from at least 300,000 years ago. The cave paintings at Lascaux and Altamira demonstrate sophisticated representational thinking, compositional planning, and symbolic communication from roughly 17,000 to 35,000 years ago. Cave art in Sulawesi, Indonesia, has been dated by uranium series methods to at least 45,500 years ago. Artifacts from Blombos Cave in South Africa include ochre engravings with geometric patterns dated to approximately 77,000 years ago, and shell beads used as personal ornaments dated to more than 100,000 years ago. The person who produced those ornaments had a brain functionally equivalent to yours. They were making jewelry instead of reading research papers, not because they were less intelligent, but because no one had yet invented writing, agriculture, metallurgy, or any of the accumulated tools that their intelligence had not yet had 100,000 years to build and transmit. The agricultural revolution, approximately 10,000 years ago, did not upgrade human cognitive hardware. It changed the material and social conditions under which the same hardware operated, enabling cumulative knowledge development that was impossible without stable food surplus and dense population. Intelligence and the accumulated products of intelligence operating over time are different variables. The Paleolithic artists were carrying the same hardware. 92, the 1998 Lancet paper by Andrew Wakefield suggesting a link between the MMR vaccine and autism was retracted by the Lancet in 2010 after investigation found that Wakefield had manipulated patient data, conducted invasive procedures on children without proper ethical approval, and had been paid more than £400,000 by lawyers seeking evidence against vaccine manufacturers before conducting the research. A financial conflict of interest he did not disclose. Wakefield's medical license was revoked in 2010 by the UK General Medical Council for serious professional misconduct. The paper studied 12 children. A 2019 Danish cohort study of more than 650,000 children found no increased risk of autism among MMR vaccinated versus unvaccinated children across any examined subgroup. One of dozens of large-scale independent studies reaching the same conclusion across multiple countries and research teams. Measles outbreaks in previously vaccinated populations, deaths from vaccine-preventable diseases, and documented resurgences of diseases that had been approaching elimination followed in the years after the paper's publication, and during the years its influence persisted after retraction. A fraudulent study of 12 children conducted by a man being paid to produce a specific result, retracted after falsification was documented, continues to shape medical decisions for millions of people. The correction reached fewer people than the original claim. It still does. 93. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built by ancient Egyptians using tools, labor organization, and logistics that are substantially understood, documented, and consistent with what Egyptian civilization demonstrably possessed in 2560 BCE. Workers' villages at Giza contain bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities indicating a permanent skilled workforce of approximately 20,000 to 30,000 paid workers. Papyri discovered at Wadi al-Jarf in 2013, the oldest papyri ever found, are the logbook of Inspector Merer, recording limestone block transportation to Giza from Tura quarries via the Nile during the reign of Khufu. This is a direct contemporary administrative record of pyramid construction logistics, written by someone doing the work. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that copper and stone tools available to ancient Egyptians could cut and shape the limestone used, and experimental teams have moved granite blocks using wooden sledges, water lubrication, and coordinated human effort at rates consistent with the pyramid's construction timeline. The precision of the Great Pyramid's base, level to within 2.1 centimeters, is extraordinary and achievable, with plumb bobs, water levels, set squares, and measuring rods that the Egyptians demonstrably possessed and used. Attributing the pyramids to aliens or lost civilizations requires believing that Egyptians, who documented their society in extraordinary detail, somehow failed to document the most impressive construction project in human history. They documented it. The receipts exist. 94. Depression is not caused by low serotonin. The simple chemical imbalance model of mental illness, particularly the serotonin deficiency account of depression, was always an oversimplification of incomplete science that was amplified beyond its evidential basis in pharmaceutical marketing and public health communication beginning in the 1990s. A 2022 umbrella review by Joanna Moncrief and colleagues examining the broader serotonin depression literature found no consistent evidence that depression is associated with reduced serotonin levels or serotonin activity, a publication that generated significant academic debate but reflected long-standing methodological concerns among researchers in the field. SSRIs help many people with depression, but a treatment affecting a neurochemical system is not evidence that the system's deficiency caused the condition. Aspirin relieves headaches without headaches being caused by aspirin deficiency. Irving Kirsch's meta-analyses of antidepressant clinical trial data, including unpublished trials obtained through Freedom of Information requests, found that the drug placebo difference for mild to moderate depression fell below conventional clinical significance thresholds for most patients, while effects for severe depression were more substantial. Mental health conditions involve complex interactions of genetics, early experience, social environment, cognitive patterns, and neurobiological factors that resist reduction to a single neurotransmitter level. The brain is the most complex object in the known universe. The explanation that achieved dominant cultural status for why it goes wrong was a marketing simplified version of science that was incomplete when it was simplified. 95. H. pylori survives in the human stomach by producing urease, an enzyme that breaks down urea into ammonia and carbon dioxide, creating a locally neutralized chemical environment around the bacterium while it lives in one of the most acidic spaces in the vertebrate digestive system. It has been doing this in human stomachs for at least 100,000 years, long enough to have co-migrated with human populations out of Africa, with bacterial genetic diversity tracking human population movements in ways that have been used to reconstruct prehistoric human migration patterns. The assumption that stomach acid sterilizes everything ingested contributed to delayed recognition of foodborne illness as a significant public health concern and to systematic underestimation of how contaminated food could cause disease in people whose stomach acid was, by assumption, handling the problem. Salmonella, E. coli, O157, H7, Listeria, and numerous other foodborne pathogens have acid resistance mechanisms, allowing survival through gastric passage. Stomach pH varies significantly depending on food content, medication use, age, and individual variation, creating windows of reduced acidity during which protection is further reduced. The bacterium that lives permanently in stomach acid as its preferred habitat evolved that capability over 100,000 years of selection pressure. The stomach acid didn't kill it during that entire period. Assuming stomach acid handles everything, because it is acidic, is exactly the kind of confident inference that H. pylori has been professionally refuting since before recorded history. 96. Educated medieval Europeans knew the Earth was spherical, and this knowledge was never lost in the tradition of medieval scholarship that produced the universities, cathedrals, and intellectual frameworks of the period. Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, Dante Alighieri, and Roger Bacon all described a spherical Earth explicitly. Dante's Divine Comedy, composed in the early 14th century, is built on a spherical cosmological structure, with Jerusalem at the center of the inhabited hemisphere. The poem's entire architecture requires a spherical Earth and would be spatially incoherent on any other geometry. Medieval universities taught astronomy using Ptolemy's Almagest as a standard text, and the Almagest describes a spherical Earth with calculated circumference. The flat Earth narrative was formalized as a description of medieval belief by Washington Irving's 1828 fictional biography of Columbus, which invented the story of Columbus arguing against a flat Earth-believing church. A narrative device that Irving created and that has been repeated as history in educational contexts ever since. The actual dispute over Columbus's voyage was about the Earth's circumference, not its shape. Scholars argued correctly that Columbus had underestimated the distance to Asia and would exhaust supplies before arriving. They were right. He found a different continent. The medieval period is the screen onto which subsequent eras project whatever ignorance they most want to feel superior to. What those eras actually projected tells you more about themselves than about the medieval period. 97. The dead outnumber the living by approximately 13 to 1. The Population Reference Bureau estimates that approximately 108 billion humans have been born since the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens roughly 50,000 years ago. Current world population is approximately 8 billion. Subtracting the living from the total born produces approximately 100 billion deaths. Roughly 12.5 dead people for every person alive right now. The claim that the living outnumber the dead appears to have circulated in the 1970s and 80s, during a period of rapid population growth when demographic projections were generating significant public attention, and the math did not support it even then. The error involves conflating growth rate with absolute numbers. Human population has expanded rapidly in recent centuries, but the species has been reproducing and dying for at least 50,000 years, with high birth rates matched by correspondingly high death rates through most of that span. This is a mathematical claim, falsifiable by demographic estimation, that circulates in compilations of mind-blowing facts in an era when the arithmetic required to check it has never been more accessible. The dead outnumber you by 13 to 1. They have always outnumbered you. The fact that this is surprising reflects how poorly human intuition handles the cumulative arithmetic of deep time operating on a reproducing population. 98. There is no 24-hour waiting period required by law or standard police policy before filing a missing person report anywhere in the United States federal legal framework, and this rule does not exist in standard law enforcement procedure in most jurisdictions that have been examined for it. People have failed to report missing family members immediately because of a procedural requirement that does not exist in the hours that investigators identify as most critical for gathering perishable evidence and locating living individuals. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children explicitly states that reports should be filed immediately. Amber Alert systems for missing children require immediate reporting as a functional prerequisite. Many states maintain rapid response systems for vulnerable adults with dementia or cognitive disabilities that similarly eliminate any waiting period by design. The myth may derive from historical informal police practices. Officers sometimes discouraged immediate reports for adults who might have voluntarily left a situation. But these were never formal requirements and have been actively discouraged in modern law enforcement training focused on missing persons outcomes. In documented homicide investigations, the first 24 to 48 hours are consistently identified as the most critical window for evidence collection and suspect identification. A rule that does not exist has had more practical effect on how people respond to emergencies than many rules that do. The fictional procedure has a body count. 99. alcohol does not kill neurons through normal drinking. It disrupts neuronal communication and impairs function acutely and reversibly. The specific claim that each drink destroys brain cells permanently, repeated in school health education, anti-drinking campaigns, and casual adult conversation for decades, is not supported by the neuroscientific evidence and conflates acute functional impairment with permanent structural damage in a way that misrepresents the mechanism while pursuing an accurate public health goal. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, the severe neurological damage associated with chronic alcoholism, is caused by thiamine deficiency resulting from the poor nutritional status that accompanies heavy sustained drinking, not directly by ethanol-killing neurons at the cellular level. It is preventable and partially treatable with thiamine replacement, which would not be possible if the damage were purely a product of direct neurotoxic cell death. Adolescent brains are genuinely more vulnerable to alcohol's effects than adult brains, and chronic heavy use produces measurable cognitive changes in adults. The public health concern is real, and the evidence base is substantial. The mechanism taught to support the concern was wrong. Health education selected a memorable inaccuracy over an accurate complication because the inaccuracy fit on a poster and the complication required more explanation than the format permitted. The neurons were the collateral damage of a communication strategy. 100. The conflict thesis. The idea that science and religion are fundamentally opposed forces that have been at war throughout history, with religion systematically suppressing scientific progress, was formalized as a historical argument by John William Draper in 1874 and Andrew Dixon White in 1896. Both books are now considered historically unreliable by historians of science, who spent the 20th century correcting their specific claims against the archival record. Copernicus was a canon of the Catholic Church. Gregor Mendel, who founded the science of genetics, was an Augustinian friar who conducted his foundational pea plant experiments within a monastery with institutional support. Georges Lemaitre, who first proposed the mathematical framework for an expanding universe that became the basis for Big Bang cosmology, was a Catholic priest. The medieval Islamic world preserved and substantially extended Greek scientific knowledge during a period when European scholarship contracted. This occurred within a deeply religious civilization that understood natural philosophy as compatible with theological inquiry. The Galileo affair, which functions as the canonical example of religious science suppression, involved political, personal, and theological dimensions more complex than the simple suppression narrative captures, including Galileo insulting Pope Urban VIII in print after years of institutional support. The conflict thesis was written by people who wanted the conflict to exist in 1874 and 1896. Historians spent the following century finding a more complicated picture. The thesis is itself an example of history written to confirm a predetermined conclusion. 101. We do not know what 95% of the universe is made of. Dark matter and dark energy together constitute approximately 95% of the universe's total mass energy content by current estimates. Both are inferred from their gravitational and cosmological effects. Neither has been directly detected or identified as a specific particle or field. We are calling them dark because that is what you call something when you have no idea what it is and need a word that communicates the absence of information without communicating embarrassment about the absence. The hard problem of consciousness, why physical brain processes produce subjective experience, remains genuinely unsolved, with no scientific consensus on mechanism. The matter-antimatter asymmetry problem requires an explanation that current physics cannot fully provide. The history documented across the preceding 100 items shows a consistent, reliable, repeating pattern. The most confident claims of each era are frequently the ones most thoroughly revised by the next. The most prestigious institutional endorsements have attached themselves to frameworks that later proved wrong, And the people who were catastrophically mistaken were not stupid or uniquely credulous. They were working with the best available tools and the most respected frameworks of their time, the same position you occupy right now. Every era believed it was cleaning up the details. The details turned out to be most of it. There is no particular reason to believe the current era is the exception to a pattern that is held without interruption for 2,500 years. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.